started.
Yours on too.
Okay. The committee will now come to order. First, I want to welcome and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We have a very distinguished, knowledgeable group of witnesses that are coming to help us deal with climate change and the important role that we in agriculture must fulfill. Let me say at the outset that my concern in putting this hearing together rests with this. It is most important that agriculture, our industry, be at the point of the spear in dealing with climate change. Why? Nobody, no entity on earth is more dependent on the climate than agriculture. Our food production, the water we drink, our shelter from our forestry, textiles, our clothing. We can do without a lot of things, but we cannot do without food, water, our clothing, our shelter coming from our forestry. And so this is why this committee hearing is most important. And I want to thank our distinguished panelists for being with us. And so, first of all, I want to get a few housekeeping matters out of the way. First of all, after giving brief opening remarks, members will definitely receive testimony from our outstanding witnesses today, and then the hearing will be open for questions. Members will be recognized in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority members, and in order of arrival for those members who have joined us after the hearing was called to order. And when you are recognized, you will be asked to unmute your microphone, and you will have 5 minutes to ask your questions or make your comment. And now I really want to emphasize, members, please keep your phones muted. If you're not speaking, as we hear right now, there's a member that's not doing that. And we have got to be respectful, and I'm laying down the law. I will just announce you not participating. These are some outstanding and gifted witnesses, and I want this committee to show them the respect that they deserve. And it's important that we hear every word of what you committee members are saying. We have to respect one another. So, when you're not speaking, turn that microphone off. Thank you for doing that. Now, members will be recognized in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority members, and in order of arrival for those members who are joining us late. And as I said, when you are asked to mute your microphone, please do so that if you're not speaking, you will remain muted in order to keep the background noise out. And in order to get as many questions as possible, the timer will stay consistently visible on your screen. I'm going to be very punctual with good discipline here to keep members to your 5 minutes. The other thing I want to say is this. This is about climate change, the most pressing issue that's facing us today. And nobody is more impacted than us, agriculture. So for those members who have in mind to bring up any other subject other than what we are here to do, will not be recognized. All right? We're here to deal with climate change, nothing else. I want to make that clear. All right. Now, just a few brief remarks from me on this. As I said at the outset, this is our most important hearing, folks. We are the leaders in Congress that must deal with climate change. And the way that we are functioning on that is through what is referred to as carbon credits, carbon markets. That's is the process and the tool that we have. And we have a variety of firms who are engaged in carbon markets, carbon credits, and each of these are working and developing working partnerships with our farmers to determine the way to do it. There is a variation in some of our companies how they are engaging our farmers and agriculture interests. Bayer, for example, is working with our farmers, but they are compensating their partnership based upon the farmers doing natural things like cover crops, no-till farming. And then there are others who are doing it by the amount of carbon that our farmers sequester. But we have problems in verification, weaknesses, the technology that is used here, the impact of our farmers not having access readily to the internet. These present awesome problems. So we've got to really deal with those issues. Secondly, in bringing and engaging our farmers in helping us with climate change, in what we're doing, to what degree does that take them from doing what we need so badly, and that is maintaining our excellent food supply? We've got some serious questions that we've got to deal with. I'm very excited about this hearing. I want to thank you all for it. And now let us go forward and have a tremendous hearing. The eyes and ears of the nation is on this hearing this day. Let us make them very proud that this House Agriculture Committee is securing our role being at the top of the point of the spear when it comes to dealing with our federal policy, congressional policy. It's got to, first of all, come through agriculture. This is the goal here, and let us proceed. And with that, I will turn it over to our distinguished ranking member for his opening remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. Thanks for holding this hearing to review carbon markets, and my appreciation to a distinguished panel of witnesses that we have. Really looking forward to that. Mr. Chairman, I do want to say, and I encourage all of our members on both sides of the aisle to focus on this incredibly important issue. Although I do want to say, in my previous role as vice chair of this committee, I had tolerated a lot of diatribes from members across the aisle who inserted issues that weren't really relevant or germane to the hearings and the things we were talking about. So I don't think in any way we should run this according to procedure, and I appreciate how you do that. But I don't think we should be ever stepping on the rights and the privileges that every one of our members have to exercise their voice. This is an incredibly important topic today. No, I approach it from, and as we explore this, I do this I look at this in a spirit of optimism. The fact that we know that natural land-based solutions, which is agriculture, it's all forms of agriculture, including forestry, as I like to tell my friends like Mr. Rouser and Mr. Scott, including trees, whether we free range them like I do in Pennsylvania or you all line them up you're very organized in certain states with your trees. And the fact that we know that the data shows that we sequester 6.1 gigatons of carbon annually at this point. And as I like to say, I have no idea how big a gigaton is, but to put it into perspective, at the end of the day, the data also shows that we sequester over 10% more carbon than what we produce on those lands, leading to the conclusion by a third party, the number one thing that we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions around the world is for American farmers, ranchers, and foresters to produce more and export it overseas, largely because of our productivity has increased 287% in 40 years. Pretty impressive. So I look at this not as doom and gloom in this discussion, but as an optimism, because it is the American farmer, rancher, and forester that's leading on climate and doing the right things. And we know that it's what we do in American agriculture is science, technology, and innovation, so that means we can always do it better, and we should push ourselves to even increase those numbers. In July, I requested this hearing along with legislative hearings on several proposed climate bills within our jurisdiction, and unfortunately, it seems that many members and stakeholders felt rushed to move legislation on carbon markets without Congress thoroughly vetting the issue, and that's why I'm thankful for this hearing today. That's what we're doing. We're vetting today. Honestly, I would have preferred a hearing on the many issues the committee should be addressing, such as the Farm Bill implementation, the oversight of COVID relief, or simply a general audience with the Secretary of Agriculture or other USDA officials. I've especially said I support the private marketplace and feel comfortable to let it potentially grow into a means of supporting farmers' journeys to more sustainable practices, or ultimately let it fail if the economics don't work for the farmers and ranchers. Both the Senate's insistence on instituting what is essentially a new regulatory regime through the Growing Climate Solutions Act, that body is forcing the House to evaluate the efficacy of these markets now. Now, without government intervention, the marketplace could answer questions of permanence, science, or fairness of the markets. And if we provide market information through a USDA website, as the Growing Climate Solutions Act requires, the government becomes a certifier of the middlemen. Now, we need to be more diligent in our oversight of these markets and as players now before we legislate in this space. As farm groups across the spectrum have lavished praise on these markets, we only now are hearing from participants about the enormous length and complexity of contracts and the meager prices farmers receive through these markets. The markets are woefully inadequate in covering even the basic implementation cost of carbon sequestering practices. One example presented in a recent report by the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition is especially telling. The Natural Resource Conservation Service will pay a producer $53.41 an acre over 5 years to implement cover crops through EQIP. Still, the current price in the indigo agriculture carbon market is $3.30 per acre. By passing the Growing Climate Solutions Act, Congress is implicitly supporting these minuscule prices. Additionally, there's been very little discussion on the effect of these markets on the socially disadvantaged community. Most carbon markets prioritize large operations, large acreage to gain the economies of scale. It's understandable. Again, as noted in NSAC's report, NORI requires a minimum of 1,000 acres enrolled to qualify. Now, giving more resources to the largest and most innovative farms seems regressive when Congress and the administrations are trying to ensure socially disadvantaged farmers who overwhelmingly operate small farms and small acreage are treated fairly. Another problem I see is stakeholders, including the Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance, continue to suggest policy proposals to make up for the inequities of the carbon markets that is incredibly small compared to our current Farm Bill conservation programs. Policy suggestions such as payments for early adopters, a carbon bank to increase the price and demand of credits, and the carbon bank to help with other racial, regional, and economic disparities, again, illustrate the need to evaluate these markets. Now, I recognize the landscape of this subject has changed over the past decade, but I think it behooves us to remember that during the 111th Congress, we debated cap and trade. And at first, farmers and ranchers were sold on the opportunity to find new markets from trading sequestered carbon. When we all saw how that could have ended, with minimal opportunity for row crops to participate and a rise in the cost of inputs. Now, I sincerely wish USDA was here to testify, as Republicans suggested to the majority, to answer questions on these markets. If they were invited to testify today, USDA would tell us the top 3 barriers to entry for agricultural producers participating in private carbon markets are a lack of demand, confusion in the marketplace, and high transaction costs with very little benefits for farmers. And we would hear from 2013 through June 2020, just less than 140 million carbon credits were verified across all industries in the United States. Of those credits, about 2.5 million, less than 2%, came from the agriculture sector. So here we are discussing a market that provides a few $1,000,000 a year to U.S. producers that do not cover the costs of their activities compared to the current Farm Bill conservation programs that provide nearly $6 billion per year in incentives and cost shares. And I think we're both very proud of the fact of what that Farm Bill conservation title does. Now, I ask my colleagues, do we understand the complicated process landowners have to go through to generate and become profitable in a carbon market? Do we have a sense of what is happening in the private sector and the markets currently? Why is there so much focus on carbon sequestration and not on other environmental service markets? Why should USDA resources be diverted from proven conservation programs to stand up carbon markets as proposed in related legislation? Now, I really do want to thank the chairman for allowing witnesses with diverse opinions to testify in these markets, unlike the Senate Agriculture Committee, who only permitted witnesses favorable to the Growing Climate Solutions Act, ensuring the narrative of no concern with these markets was upheld. Now, I look forward to a more robust conversation. Really looking forward to the testimony of all of our witnesses and their perspective and experiences. But again, I want to make clear this subject and the related legislation deserve much more scrutiny than one hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I have a point of order.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I have a point of order. Mr. Chairman, I have a point of order.
The chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so witnesses may begin their testimony and to ensure that
Mr. Chair, I have a point of order that is timely.
For questions.
Mr.
Our
Chairman, I have a point of order that is
today
timely.
Are the following. Ms. Debbie Reed.
Mr. Chairman, I have a point of order that is timely. Mr. Chairman, my
Scott,
point of
you're
order.
out of order.
No, sir.
This meeting goes forward.
With all due respect, Chairman, you're out of order. I have a point of order that is timely. I made a point of order that is timely.
Mr. Scott, I'm tired of your shenanigans. I am tired of your disrespect. And if you do not change what you're doing.
I have a point of order that's timely, Mr. Chairman. My question is, where in the rules does the chair get to dictate what a member can and cannot discuss? We have always, regardless of who is in charge,
to be respectful. Now, Mr. Scott, you have used every single meeting we have had. You have disrespected the blueberry bill, of which was there for a very good industry. You have disrespected other members' bills. Every meeting, you have tried to hijack this committee.
That's not true,
And here
Mr.
we
Chairman.
are. Yes, it is.
It's not
So,
true.
with that, I am moving this meeting on. I am not going to allow you to disrespect these witnesses with your selfishness
Chair-
and your disrespect.
Mr. Chairman, I ask
The
a simple
meeting goes
question.
forward.
I ask you a simple question. Where in the rules do
meeting
you have the
goes
authority to tell a member what they can and cannot ask?
Our witnesses today are Ms. Debbie Reed, Executive Director of the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. We have Mr. Leo Bastos, Senior Vice President, Head of Global Commercial Ecosystems at Bayer. We also have Mr. Brian Lamar, President and Chief Executive Officer at the Westerfield Company on behalf of National Alliance of Forest Owners. We also have Mr. David Antonelia E., Chief Executive Officer at Vera. We also have Ms. Callie Adelberg, Director of Government Relations at Environmental Defense Fund. And we also have Mr. David Milligan, President of the National Association of Wheat Growers. And we also have Ms. Jeannie Merrill, Policy Director at the California Climate and Agriculture Network on behalf of National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. What a wonderful and distinguished group of witnesses we have. And I am so pleased to have each of you here with us. The process for you witnesses will proceed as follows. Each of you, when you're called upon, will have 5 minutes. There is a timer that should be visible to you on your screen and will count down to 0, at which point your time has expired. So, Ms. Reed, let us begin with you when you are ready. And welcome, Ms. Reed.
Morning, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm Debbie Reed, the Executive Director of the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium and our research arm, the Ecosystem Services Market Research Consortium. With 25 years experience working in private voluntary carbon and ecosystem service markets with an exclusive focus on agriculture, I'm delighted to see the strong and growing interest in the value of natural climate solutions from working ag lands. ESMC is a member-based nonprofit organization with over 80 members across the agricultural supply chain and value chain. Our members have co-invested with us in a national scale, science-based, voluntary ecosystem service market program devoted exclusively to agriculture. We generate multiple stacked environmental credits from farms and ranches. Our members include a wide range of food and beverage companies, agribusinesses, farmer-led associations, farmer checkoffs and cooperatives, conservation NGOs, and land-grant universities. Our innovative program generates multiple credits in high demand from corporates, as well as from municipalities and government agencies, all of whom currently engaged in our projects across the country as buyers of these credits. ESMC's mission is to scale soil health and beneficial impacts from agriculture. That success requires that we adequately compensate farmers and ranchers for their services that are in such high demand and provide them the tools to be successful in these markets. While we can operate in traditional carbon markets, right now we're not. To meet our members' highest needs, we're operating in a new market context across agricultural supply chains. Private sector action is the reason there's a new and significant demand for natural climate solutions and ecosystem services markets. Our member corporations in the food and beverage sector and ag value chain are investing millions of dollars to reduce their environmental footprint from food and agriculture. ESMC is an enabling program to leverage those private sector investments and ensure these organizations are successful at scale. This new market is different than traditional carbon offset markets and can provide additional income streams to farmers and ranchers. When private sector corporations calculate their greenhouse gas inventory and commit to reduce that inventory, they calculate their direct greenhouse gas emissions from their facilities and operations and their indirect emissions from their supply chains. Corporations can purchase carbon offsets to help reduce their direct greenhouse gas emissions, but market standards and accounting rules prohibit the purchase of offset credits to reduce indirect supply chain emissions. Companies have to actively generate emission reductions from the farms and the ranches they produce products from and purchase those products from. And they file annual reports quantifying the environmental impacts achieved. Those supply chain emission reductions are referred to as insets. They are not the same as carbon offsets. They are not tradable assets like carbon offsets, and they can't be generated, claimed, or sold to anyone outside the ag supply chain. Up to 90% of the total greenhouse gas footprint for many food and beverage companies is from their indirect agricultural supply chain. That means the majority of their actions and investments have to come from farmers and ranchers in their supply chain. It's costly and resource intensive for every company to do that individually across their entire supply chain for all their purchased commodities. And it's hard to reach farmers and ranchers across the country. ESMC's program enables collective action across our members, which include buyers and sellers in the same supply chains and on-the-ground partners like the Nature Conservancy and farm organizations. Ours is a collective team effort. Our model allows multiple members to co-invest in projects and share costs. ESMC ensures the protocols we use are standards-based, science-based, transparent, and validated by global standard bodies. And we undertake the role of quantification. We work with independent verifiers, and we issue high-quality credits that corporations buy. We then pay the farmers and ranchers whose actions create the value. We can stack and sell the credits in a bundle or disaggregate and sell them separately. Our member corporations, including companies like General Mills, ADM, Nestle, and McDonald's, for instance, are buying the carbon inset credits, and in some cases, the water quality credits from these projects as well. We have municipalities and state agencies, such as the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, who are purchasing the water quality credits. And we recently launched our first cropland project, which includes biodiversity credits as well, to be purchased by the Missouri Department of Conservation. I'd like to publicly thank our members and funders for their partnership, their collaboration, and ongoing contributions. I appreciate the opportunity to appear here today to discuss how these markets work and how they can benefit farmers and ranchers. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Reed, for your excellent testimony. And now I will turn next to Mr. Bastos. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding this important hearing today and for inviting me to testify. My name is Leo Bastos, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Global Commercial Ecosystems at Bayer Crop Science. Bayer Crop Science is a division of Bayer that works with farmers to provide them with seeds, traits, crop protection products, and digital farming products to American farmers. Bayer is committed to decarbonize the agriculture sector and remove greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere to reduce the impacts of climate change. We are also committed to research and innovation to increase agriculture's resiliency to climate change impacts that are actually reduced and farmers are already experiencing. Agriculture can be part of the solution for climate change by helping farmers produce more while removing greenhouse gases and storing carbon deep into the soil. Carbon markets are an economically efficient way to reduce greenhouse gases by incentivizing adoption of agronomic practices that contribute to healthier soils, enhancing yield, while ensuring growers that can turn their soil into a big part of their farming business. More than a year ago, Bayer began enrolling farmers in a carbon program that pays them to adopt agronomic practices, primarily no-till and cover crops. And these farmers do not have to be part of their customer base. They don't have to buy a Bayer seed. They do not have to buy a Bayer crop inputs to participate in the program. There are a couple of things that make us a little bit different. One is we eliminate the risk for farmers economically because they have typically to invest upfront. They have to measure and then get paid. What we actually do is pay upfront so farmers can make an economic decision and have the opportunity to participate in carbon marketplace. The second thing, and it still is in development, is a low-touch, low-cost verification and quantification of carbon sequestration. So there is more money available as a revenue stream for farmers. We're harnessing the power of farm data, digital technologies, and imagery to verify, quantify, and validate the carbon stored into the soil. And as carbon prices actually go up, farmers actually benefit from higher payments as well. Soil carbon standards are evolving and are being worked on by multiple global standard organizations, leading to still numerous questions and uncertainty. We hear from farmers every day that this uncertainty reduces their willingness to participate in carbon markets, where they can be sure whether their investment is going to create a verified carbon credit. In order to move carbon markets forward, we must tackle this uncertainty and the resulting confusion by having common standards. This committee can help voluntary markets scale up faster and provide more certainty for farmers in this rapidly evolving space. One way is to consider the growing Climate Solutions Act, which provides a foundation for assisting farmers in navigating a complex system. Another is work with the USDA on clarifying the concept of the carbon bank. Farmers and companies are expecting more clarity to make investments and decisions. Bayer's carbon program in the US is just the beginning. We are enabling and incentivizing farmers to adopt climate-smart practices to capture and sequester carbon in their fields. Similar programs are now live in Brazil, Argentina, India, and some select European countries. That's a good proposition for growers, consumers, and our planet. With the 2018 Farm Bill, this committee made historic investments in on-farm conservation. Once again, this committee is in the position to shape the future of American agriculture and ensure that farmers can participate and benefit from the growing demand for sustainably produced foods. We look forward to helping you and our farmer customers make the most of this exciting new opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bustos. And now our next witness is Mr. Luama.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the House Agriculture Committee. We thank you for the opportunity to testify. Thank you also to all the bipartisan Working Forest Caucus members who serve on this committee, including Ranking Member Thompson and Caucus Co-Chair Sanford Bishop. I'm Brian Luoma. I'm the president and CEO of the Westervelt Company, headquartered in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The Westervelt Company was founded in 1884 and is currently under its fourth generation of family leadership. Westervelt is an industry leader in land management and wood products manufacturing, as well as environmental mitigation. We own and manage more than 500,000 acres, and we believe that sustainability is both our responsibility and our legacy. Our nation's forests are our most important carbon asset. They sequester and store billions of tons of carbon through tree growth, and they store billions more tons of carbon in wood products. Together, forest and wood products already offset 15% of the US industrial carbon emissions each year. 70% of working forests in the US are privately owned by families. Working forests are sustainably managed to supply 90% of the wood and fiber for the forest products we use every day. At the same time, these forests account for nearly 3/4 of our gross forest carbon sequestration, enough to offset greenhouse gas emissions from all passenger vehicles in the US each year. But that's not all. Private forests also store an additional 83 billion metric tons of carbon, more than all other forests combined. Wood is 50% carbon by weight, so we continue to store carbon in long-lived wood products like the wood we use in building construction. Today, wood products store more than 10 billion tons of carbon. That's nearly 3 times the amount stored in all of our national parks combined. Strong traditional forest product market are the key to these carbon benefits. New voluntary markets for forest carbon and increased wood use in mass timber construction offer new opportunities for even greater carbon benefits. Forest carbon projects that sequester and store more atmospheric carbon are rapidly attracting customers in voluntary markets seeking to reduce their carbon footprints. To date, the volume of forest carbon purchased has increased by over 240% over 2020 levels, but mostly in Asia. Even though we have an abundance of forest in the US and in North America, forest carbon markets here are relatively small and maturing, particularly in the voluntary markets. We've learned much from the first generation of forest carbon projects through the contributions of carbon registries like Verra that do exceptionally good work to help verify carbon benefits. We see 2 clear opportunities. First, we can increase market participation among private forest owners in the voluntary markets with improved protocols and reducing unnecessary cost and complexity. Second, we can increase confidence in the high quality forest carbon among carbon purchasers in voluntary markets through improved data, analysis, measurement, and verification. USDA operates the Forest Inventory Analysis Program, the world's most comprehensive forest census. Further improvement to the carbon data and analysis provided through FIA will help scale projects more quickly and reliably. Congress is also working to address these challenges. The Growing Climate Solutions Act, which passed the Senate 92-8, provides a template. Increased use of wood in the built environment, such as using advanced engineered wood products like mass timber, significantly reduce the amount of energy required for the building construction while storing vast amounts of carbon in the completed structure. Mass timber markets will continue to significantly benefit significantly from improved data analysis via life cycle assessments. Reduction of the carbon footprint in public and private buildings will also further wood utilization. Recently, I joined 42 of my fellow CEOs and counterparts at the Environmental Defense Fund and the Nature Conservancy to adopt a set of principles outlining how private forests can provide market and incentive-based climate solutions. We also work closely with the Forest Climate Working Group and the Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance. These collaborations are helping us find common ground that help pave the way for smart policy. My colleagues at the National Alliance of Forest Owners have put together a data visualization of Forest Service and EPA data available at forestcarbondataviz.org. We urge you to use this information to recognize and advance the vital role private forests can play. Thank you again for conducting this hearing. The Westervelt Company and the National Alliance of Forest Owners stand ready as willing partners. I will welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Luama, for your excellent testimony. And now I recognize Mr. Antonia Lee. Please, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Pardon me if I didn't get all the syllables in your name correct.
It's okay. Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members. My name is David Antonioli. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Verra, a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. Thank you for the invitation to speak at today's hearing. Verra manages the world's leading greenhouse gas or carbon crediting program, the Verified Carbon Standard or VCS program. Since 2007, we have issued 760 million credits from over 1,700 projects worldwide, including 28 million credits from over 80 projects in the United States. Today, I share 3 messages. First, how carbon crediting programs operate. Second, how voluntary carbon markets are evolving at home and abroad. Third, how participating in voluntary carbon markets can benefit the American agriculture and forestry sectors. Let me begin with how our program works. A project proponent, such as a farmer or forest owner, proposes an activity to reduce or remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. For example, shifting to cover cropping or planting trees. They prepare a document describing their activity, how it meets all of the relevant VCS program requirements, and demonstrate how the activity will cut emissions beyond what they would have been in the absence of the project. The document is posted for public comment and is assessed by independent auditors, whose work we oversee. Vera conducts a final assessment and formally registers the project if we find that the project meets all of our requirements. The proponent must then implement their project, monitor emissions over time, and calculate its emissions impacts. Once again, they provide documents for assessment by independent auditors and then by us. Assuming we find the emission reductions meet all of our requirements, we then issue carbon credits, 1 carbon credit per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that was reduced or removed. Credits can be used for various purposes. Most commonly, corporations use them to voluntarily compensate for their emissions and declare this in their annual or sustainability reports. Once used, a carbon credit is removed from the market and cannot be used by anyone else. High-integrity carbon crediting programs possess several attributes to ensure the integrity of the credits they issue. First, they rely on scientifically sound methodologies or protocols to quantify the emission reductions. Currently, Vera has approved 6 methodologies in the agricultural sector and 14 in the forestry sector. Second, they rely on independent auditing. Expert independent auditors assess projects and credits at all stages against the requirements of the relevant carbon crediting program. For their part, carbon crediting programs need to ensure that the auditors working under their programs are trained and accredited properly. And third, they rely on a publicly accessible registry. Credits are uniquely identified, linked to project records, and tracked to prohibit double counting. My second message is that voluntary markets are evolving globally. To address the climate emergency, nearly 27 billion tons of emission reductions worldwide must be reduced or removed. Voluntary carbon markets, which could generate 2 to 3 billion tons of this annual reduction, remain a small but important part of the solution, especially because they have the infrastructure and capacity to scale up quickly. And this growth has already begun. Demand is escalating rapidly, fueled primarily by corporations seeking to fulfill net zero or zero emissions pledges, including major American and international corporations. And when demand grows, supply grows too. Vera issued 141 million credits last year, and we anticipate that doubling this year. And this takes me to my third and final message. Participating in voluntary carbon markets can benefit the American agriculture and forestry sectors. And I say this for a few reasons. The first is that nature-based solutions can reduce emissions in the near term versus technological solutions that are still very expensive and will require time to scale up. The second is that nature-based solutions deliver many beyond carbon benefits. They improve water quality, they prevent erosion, and they protect biodiversity. The third is that finance from carbon credits can lead to important innovations, such as supporting the transition to regenerative agriculture and the ongoing development of science and technology to measure soil carbon. Fourth and finally, high-integrity carbon crediting programs provide American farmers and forest owners the ability to secure finance that will help them implement farming and forest management practices that benefit both them and the climate. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your excellent testimony. And now, Ms. Eidelberg, please begin when you're ready for your 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Thompson, and all of the members of this committee for the opportunity and the invitation to participate in today's hearing. The topic of voluntary carbon markets is extremely timely, and it's of significant importance to farmers and all of our shared environment. I'm here to represent the Environmental Defense Fund, an international nonprofit organization that creates transformational solutions to the most serious environmental problems. We link science, economics, law, and innovative private sector partnerships to accomplish this goal. At EDF, we collaborate with farmers, farm organizations, and businesses throughout the supply chain to ensure that climate resilient and a profitable future for U.S. agriculture. Our Farmer Advisory Board is made up of large-scale conventional farmers from many of the districts represented in this room. And that Farmer Advisory Board is instrumental in shaping our agricultural policy and our research priorities. EDF has also helped to found the Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance, along with some of the leading agricultural and commodity groups. We want to build support for climate solutions and innovative approaches, including voluntary carbon markets, and we want to build them across party lines. These voluntary markets, although currently in their infancy, have the potential to reward producers for management practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions while also improving the resilience of farmers and our rural communities. I've included a number of EDF's policy recommendations that can maximize this potential in my written testimony. But in my comments today, I will emphasize 3 important considerations for this committee that will foster efficient and effective voluntary markets. First of all, there are a number of ways that working lands can contribute to and profit from climate solutions. While storing carbon in soil is one of those options, it is also one of the more difficult ways to reduce emissions, and we still have a lot to learn about its true potential. Therefore, policies and incentives should prioritize practices that are now shovel-ready and enjoy high confidence in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. These would include avoiding emissions of methane and nitrous oxide specifically. Second, because the science and data on soil sequestration is not yet fully mature, voluntary markets should remain the focus of policymakers, and I stress the word voluntary. Until we have a higher level of confidence in environmental outcomes, carbon credits should not be allowed to satisfy current or future compliance obligations, either for companies or for farmers. And third, the private sector is already engaging in the voluntary greenhouse gas marketplace, and farmers are already being paid for their environmental outcomes. However, our approaches to accounting for these environmental benefits are all over the map. There is no referee on the playing field to ensure consistency in the measurement, the reporting, or the verification of those emissions reductions. So without better standards or any type of standardization, we may very well see these markets fail. So now, and I appreciate the committee having this hearing, now is precisely the time for Congress to step in, provide some direction, and provide some guidance. America's working lands can be an important climate solution provider by reducing emissions and building resilience to climate impacts that we're already seeing on the land. Voluntary markets have the potential to increase investment in these solutions and deliver durable benefits for the climate and for farmers and ranchers and foresters. To help realize that potential, Congress and USDA should promote equitable access to financial incentives, technical assistance, and to research that will help accelerate and reward agriculture and forestry's climate contributions. EDF looks forward to working with this committee to tackle these issues, and I appreciate having this conversation with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Adelberg, for your excellent testimony. And now, Mr. Milligan, we will turn to you. Please begin when you are ready.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm David Milligan, President of the National Association of Wheat Growers. I raise wheat, corn, soybeans, and dry edible beans with my son on our farm in Cass City, Michigan. On our farm, wheat planting time is September to October. We are harvesting dry edible beans followed by seeding wheat with over 1 million seeds per acre. Soon the ground will be covered with growing wheat with active roots, providing a cover all winter. We will harvest the wheat in July. That can be followed by a cover crop like clover or perhaps a double crop of soybeans in areas where longer growing seasons. Wheat is produced in 42 states, from Washington State to Pennsylvania and from Montana to Texas. Each area has a different climate, soil, rotations, and planting dates for spring and winter wheat. The typical rainfall in wheat production regions can range dramatically from 6 inches to 35 inches. In certain regions, winter wheat can be added to a corn-soy rotation. By adding wheat to this rotation, we can add additional benefits such as reducing weed pressure, decreasing disease, and providing a cover. Any carbon market has to take this rotation into consideration. Additionally, there are some geographical regions in the United States where wheat is the only major food commodity that can be grown. Wheat growers need additional technical assistance to be able to balance the economics of their operation with the uncertainty of undertaking different management systems as the concept of common markets come to develop. The drier, arid regions where growing spring wheats have limited the use of cover crops due to the lack of moisture. They are using carbon-saving practices like residue, no-till, and reduced till to conserve moisture for the wheat crop. Many producers already practice excellent environmental stewardship that sequesters carbon and should be treated equally with new adopters under new carbon markets. Excluding early adopters does not take into consideration the long-term management and ongoing investments in environmental benefits to maintaining conservation systems such as no-till. Wheat producers have a high rate of adoption of reduced tillage, with 67% of wheat growers adopting conservation tillage. Carbon markets should not discourage production of wheat for harvest. In production agriculture, we talk a great deal about value-added products. The grain that we grow in the field goes on to a different product where processing and packaging add value along the supply chain. That $3 loaf of bread includes just pennies paid to the farmer for their wheat. The carbon credit will be generated on the farm. The farmer needs to have equitable return as the carbon credits increase in value. As the committee continues to review these issues, the voluntary carbon market should be an addition to and not replace USDA programs. USDA conservation programs, funding for wheat research, new varieties, and new technology will be necessary. Research is essential to increasing our productivity and continuing to produce more using less resources. Many of the management systems would not be possible without access to a variety of crop production tools. Conservation tillage, protecting the growing crops, and allowing us to be the most efficient with the land production requires crop production tools. NOG members are cautiously optimistic about voluntary carbon efforts. We see the potential to have both increasing positive environmental impact and additional revenue stream. However, there is still uncertainty regarding diverse rotations and different crops in the field throughout the year and the impact on some practices on crop production and quality. An added complexity of winter wheat production is a unique system of planting in the fall, providing a root system over the winter with harvest in the summer. I want to thank the chairman, the ranking member, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify today on this important topic. Wheat growers continue to have questions about the transparency and clarity of requirements, cost, measurement, and carbon pricing of the numerous voluntary carbon efforts before our growers today. Thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Milligan. Appreciate your excellent testimony. And now we turn to you, Ms. Merrill, for your testimony. You can begin now.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee. My name is Jeannie Merrill. I'm the Policy Director for the California Climate and Agriculture Network, a coalition of the state's leading sustainable and organic agriculture organizations. Since 2009, we've worked to advance agricultural solutions to the climate crisis at the state and federal levels, working in partnership with the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. Thank you for the opportunity to address the important issue of carbon markets and their potential in supporting farmers in mitigating and adapting to climate change. Today, I'll speak to the California experience of the carbon markets and our state climate smart agriculture programs. I'll begin my remarks with an overview of the original market efforts in this space. Agriculture can and must be a part of the country's efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase carbon sinks, and improve resilience. Effective policy tools exist to help farmers achieve these goals. However, since 2003, carbon markets have proved themselves an inadequate tool to reach the diversity of farmers and ranchers we must reach. Simply put, carbon market approaches at the voluntary and compliance levels have consistently failed to deliver on climate solutions in agriculture on any meaningful scale, leaving the vast majority of farmers without adequate resources to address the climate crisis. The Chicago Climate Exchange was the first national effort to put a carbon market in place in 2003. The exchange set up a market for offset credits generated by farmers whose practices reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Practices such as rotational grazing, conservation tillage, prairie plantings. Companies and local governments would buy those credits as a way of voluntarily offsetting their own emissions. Farmer response to the exchange was considerable. Within 2 years, the Farmers Union had 2.6 million agricultural acres under contract with the exchange in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Montana, and the Dakotas. The Iowa Farm Bureau had another 600,000 acres under contract. By 2010, the exchange had collapsed. The carbon market was swamped with offset credits from willing farmers, but didn't have enough buyers. And as a result, the price of carbon credits went from a high of roughly $7 to just 5 cents per metric ton of CO2 equivalent. In December 2010, the exchange closed its doors, leaving farmers without support for their projects. The next significant effort to create a carbon market came from California. In 2012, as part of its climate change law, the state launched a cap and trade program requiring large greenhouse gas emitters to participate. Now, 9 years later, there are still very few ways for farmers to earn carbon credits, and they include installing dairy digesters and taking up certain rice management practices, both aimed at reducing methane emissions. But with a low carbon price and high transaction costs for farmers, only the dairy digester projects have sold carbon credits, largely because of other state financial support for those projects. Despite the 7 years it took to develop the rice protocol for the carbon market, the state's rice producers have stayed out of the California carbon market. It just doesn't make financial sense. Instead of relying on the carbon market, starting in 2014, the state of California launched its first grants-based climate change programs for farmers and ranchers. The Climate Smart Agriculture programs bypass the complexities of the carbon market, offering farmers technical and financial assistance to develop their projects. The programs are modeled after USDA's Farm Bill conservation programs. Farmer response to the state Climate Smart Agriculture programs has been considerable, with application requests far exceeding available funding. Together, these multi-benefit climate smart projects have resulted in greenhouse gas emission reductions of more than 20 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, or the equivalent of taking more than 4.3 million cars off the road for 1 year. To summarize, carbon markets have failed to deliver on their promises. High transaction costs, the complexities of developing offset protocols for compliance markets, low carbon prices, and the inability to incentivize multi-benefit projects means few farmers can participate, and the many opportunities for agriculture to be part of the climate solution are left behind. Time is ticking. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we have only until 2030 to bend the curve on global greenhouse gas emissions to avoid the very worst of climate change impacts. We cannot waste time on complex and ineffective approaches. We have tried for nearly 20 years to make carbon markets work for agriculture, and they have failed. The good news is that we have time-tested and proven Farm Bill conservation programs that can deliver the resources farmers and ranchers need to mitigate and adapt to climate change today. And we can do this while supporting farm viability and profitability, reaching a diversity of producers, including small and mid-scale producers, farmers of color, and beginning farmers. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address the committee today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Merrill. And now, first, your testimonies were just outstanding, and you have brought some very important information and facts to the committee, and we want to thank you for that. Now, at this time, members will be recognized for questions in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority members. You will be recognized for 5 minutes each in order to allow us to get as many questions in as possible. And again, members, please keep your microphones muted until you are recognized so that we can minimize the background noise. Please remember that. And now I will start off the questions. I recognize myself for my 5 minutes. And I want to put this to every one of you, and hopefully you have time to answer it and give me your opinions. As we're moving into this area of engaging our farmers, our food producers, textile producers, forestry, all of the important elements of our agriculture production process, do any of you feel that in any way our food security production processes, the amount of food we're producing, that any of pulling our farmers away from doing what they naturally do, planting the cotton, doing what is necessary to keep our agriculture system moving, does it in any way offer any kind of negativism to our ability to keep our agriculture production at the level it needs to be if we're pulling our farmers away to engage in partnerships dealing with these credit markets, carbon markets? Would you, any of you, just comment on that? Give us a yes or no. It's important that the American people know that our food security and our agriculture production will not go down as we move farmers into engagements with carbon markets.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Milligan. I think you raise a very excellent point, and I think it is a very important fact that we need to remember food security. We don't have to go very far back to the pandemic when we saw some empty shelves. And I think that's very important as we move ahead, that food security be very top priority. And yes, I think there is some possibility that this could become a problem to food security if some of these programs I hear out there would be forcing reduced production. I think could be a concern. So yeah, I think very much appreciate you bringing that concern. I think it's a very important one.
Let me ask you, if I may, could you describe, pinpoint what that concern is? How would it negatively impact?
There seems to be certain crops that might be favored over others because of this question, carbon sequestration. One might be better than the other, which might reduce supplies. There's been some idea of idling more land might be an option. That would be a real serious consideration to the amount of production we might have.
Very good. I think you had a comment, ma'am. Go right ahead.
Sure.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And what a really important question. Many of the incentives many of the practices that are incentivized by markets and by a lot of the conservation programs that we see implemented today also have very good co-benefits for the land by increasing soil fertility. So increasing soil fertility both brings up a farmer's yield, especially over time, and decreases the negative impacts to the environment. So we frankly see this might, over time, be a strong positive, especially as we're seeing stronger storms and more extreme weather hit in more isolated areas. We want to make sure that those farmers are as resilient as they can be in these challenging times.
Thank you. Mr. Bustos, you mentioned in your testimony that Bayer is committed to share carbon credit value with farmers. How are you doing that?
Thank you, Chairman Scott. Sorry. The Bayer as a company, we actually have the focus of being a farmer-centric organization. So it needs to work for the farmers. Whatever we do needs to work for the farmers. So what we have today is a contractual agreement with the farmers that has a specific provision in terms of sharing the net proceeds of these credits as we actually have them into the market. And those net proceedings and the contractual provisions, they exist, they're audited, and there's disclosure mechanisms that we have to make sure that we are, fulfilling our promises and sharing the most of the value to the farmer.
Thank you very much. Thank both of you, all of you very much. And now, Ranking Member, Mr. Thompson, I yield 5 minutes to you. Thank you.
Chairman, thank you so much. Once again, thanks to all the witnesses. I want to start out, first question is for Ms. Jeannie Morell for the California Climate and Agriculture Network. Ms. Morell, I found your testimony very insightful, and I appreciate hearing about your experience with these markets. In your testimony, you say, quote, "Since 2003, carbon markets have provided themselves an inadequate tool to reach the diversity of farmers and ranchers that we must reach. Simply put, carbon market approaches at the voluntary and compliance levels have consistently failed to deliver on climate solutions in agriculture on any meaningful scale, leaving the vast majority of our farmers and ranchers without adequate resources to address the climate crisis." Can you summarize why in your opinion, your observations, the carbon markets have failed to deliver on their promise?
Yes, thank you. Two things. One is we've seen in California with our compliance markets, we have a regulated carbon market. And as just one example, it took 7 years for the California Rice Commission, working with environmental partners and the state, to develop a protocol to reduce methane emissions from rice production. It was complex. They were very much steeped in the science, but also steeped in the sort of practicalities of what would work for farmers. And at the end of the day, after all of those many years of trying to develop the protocol and coming up with methods of reducing methane in rice production, not a single rice producer in California or anywhere in the country, because our market is available to producers nationwide and in some parts of Canada, have signed up for that protocol. And that's because we have a relatively low price for carbon. We don't pay very well. And we have high transaction costs. And for most small and mid-scale producers, entry into the carbon market, whether it's the California version or the voluntary market, doesn't make a lot of economic sense because of those high transaction costs of developing projects, of having them verified. It's just proved a very complex and ineffective way to deliver the resources that we need to deliver, that both help farmers to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sinks, but also to become more resilient, to be able to better weather greater weather extremes. We simply haven't seen in California farmers being interested in the carbon market, but we have overwhelming demand for our state-based climate-smart or grants-based climate-smart agriculture programs, which, as I mentioned, are modeled after the USDA Farm Bill conservation programs.
Well, thank you, ma'am. Mr. Milligan, good to see you. I think the last time we crossed paths perhaps was in Michigan, and really glad to have you here. Thanks for coming to Washington. Earlier this year, I introduced the Sustains Act, which would allow for third parties, including corporations, businesses of all sizes, from large mega size, you pick it, Amazon, Google, whatever, Disney, down to the mom and pop hardware store owners on the corner, to invest in NRCS conservation programs. In doing so, it would allow the private sector to partner with farmers, ranchers, landowners, in support of agricultural conservation, the programs that we see out of the Farm Bill. Do you believe that this concept is something that you and others would support?
Thank you, Representative Thompson. Yes, I see a lot of positives to some of these programs that have the EQIP and the CSP that have been out there. They've been very positive to help growers. We certainly feel that everything needs to be voluntary, though, and they are with these programs, but looking ahead, I still think we're very important that we remain voluntary on these programs.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. We've invested billions of dollars through the Farm Bill. We're real proud of the conservation title and the benefits that brings. A lot of that has helped help us reach that natural land solutions level of 6.1 gigatons of carbon sequestered annually, and we can do better. Despite investing billions, I believe the number was that in 2020 there were 80,000 EQIP applications we couldn't fund because we had exhausted those resources. This, when you think about just doing a little bit more with EQIP and perhaps other conservation programs, how much more carbon could we sequester? And it honors the principle of you can't have a healthier environment without a healthier economy, because it's helping our farmers, ranchers, and foresters. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And now I will recognize the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, who is also Vice Chair of our Agriculture Committee here in the House. You're recognized, Ms. Adams, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member as well, and to our witnesses. Thank you for being here. Mr. Bastos, in your testimony, you suggest that there's a role for this committee and Congress to play in scaling up voluntary carbon markets. My question is, what policies or incentives can best encourage participation in carbon markets by limited resource landowners such as small, historically disadvantaged farmers?
Congresswoman Adams, thanks for the question. I think that I would say that some of the things this help scale these programs in the voluntary markets is related to bringing confidence to the market, relating to standards, investing in perhaps having the USDA to work with standards organizations to build commonality and something that can be actually shared and understood by farmers. The second piece of that is actually a bit of the research and the foundational research, and I think some of the conservation programs can actually yield some of that research data that will help benefit the markets in terms of quantification. And lastly, I would say that there's an important investment I think that needs to be done in terms of upskilling a labor force to work at the intersection of agriculture and carbon markets, so farmers can get assisted in how they implement best those practices to keep producing their crops in a sustainable manner. So these are my thoughts.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ms. Merrill, thank you for sharing the programs California farmers have been able to engage with to achieve both environmental and economic benefits. So could you speak to California's efforts to ensure that historically disadvantaged farmers are able to access and participate in the California's climate smart ag programs?
Thank you, Representative Adams, for that question. We have a very strong focus on reaching socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. We have a Farmer Equity Act that was passed in 2017 that focuses in particular on farmers of color and women farmers and making sure that our state programs are reaching them. So as part of the Climate Smart Agriculture programs, we have a technical assistance fund to provide funding for technical assistance providers, our resource conservation districts, our co-op extension folks, to develop projects, climate smart agriculture projects with farmers and to help with their application as well as project implementation. And a minimum of 25% of those dollars must benefit socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. And since that fund was created, we've seen a significant increase in the number of socially disadvantaged farmers or underserved farmers who are participating in our programs like the Healthy Soils Program and others that are really about delivering not only benefits to the environment, but also to farmers.
Okay, are they able to submit multiple applications or just a one time?
We have multiple programs, so they can submit multiple applications to those multiple programs. So whether it's Healthy Soils to look at your soil management practices, or our State Water Efficiency and Enhancement Program, which is all about better irrigation management to reduce water and energy associated with moving water.
Thanks very much. Mr. Milligan, in addition to potentially mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, many recognize that agricultural practices used to generate carbon offsets such as no-till and cover cropping provide other benefits such as reduced soil erosion and improved water management. So would you have adopted the new farming or forest management practices required for participation in the carbon market program if you had not enrolled in the program?
We as a general organization are very in favor of all the voluntary programs. And some of our members have enrolled in them and some have not.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Austin Scott, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Milligan, I'm going to come to you in a pretty quick here, but I do want to mention that when we talk about the environment, I think that we need to be talking about it as a whole, not as individual segments like carbon, for example. And I will tell you, in my district, they have cut down a tremendous number of acres of forest land that provided tremendous wildlife habitat. As we know, the forests are good for the environment and the wildlife and the water. And I think that when you cut down forest lands and replace it with solar panels, I don't know that the net is a positive for the environment as a whole. I mean, certainly the solar panels don't produce as much carbon as other methods of producing the energy, but I do think it's dangerous that we are not talking about the environment from the standpoint of wildlife habitat and water resources as a whole. And when we segment this thing out, I'm not sure that we end up with a net positive. I have a facility in Cook County, Georgia, and I was down there the other day and I asked what all of those large generators were for. I couldn't figure it out. And lo and behold, a company out of Canada is mining coins in Cook County, Georgia. And I don't understand the creation of the coins or the value of the coins, just as I don't understand the creation of the carbon credits or how the value of the carbon credits are derived. And Mr. Milligan, you're the farmer of the group. Do you understand how the carbon credits are valued and how it's determined what the farmer gets for the carbon credit?
No, I do not at this time. It is a developing market. I think that perhaps some of these markets are testing the waters, shall we say. I think we need to have the standards as to how to measure these, a consistent standard across in the grain market. You know, somebody sets a standard of what a bushel of wheat is, what it weighs, what the grade is. I think these priorities need to be established. I think there's a lot of, maybe the science isn't quite caught up to where we are yet. It's a new field. I think that we have to be real careful moving ahead. I don't think we want to make a lot of mistakes. We don't want this to fail. I think there needs to be a lot of groundwork done yet.
That's what scares me about the application of this to agriculture, is that the people who are ultimately responsible for America's food supply may be signing up for something that in some cases has a 100-year requirement on it. And we don't know even how the value is calculated or where the credit comes from, just as I don't understand the mining of coins and the value of coins. But I do know that there's a simpler way to do this. And through ASCS, we used to encourage farmers to use good practices for the environment, like no-till. And there used to be a payment, some assistance for farmers to use things like no-till, and those payments have disappeared, is my understanding. Is that correct?
I think that was touched on a little bit earlier with the ranking member. There have been some programs out there that have, I think, worked very effectively, and as we mentioned, the funding ran short on that. So, yeah, I think you make a valid point.
And so if I could, one of my concerns is that some of the people that I see up here in Washington, one of which is from my state, has adopted a lot of these practices, and that's very nice if you can afford to pay $20 for a range-fed chicken, which is what they get for a range-fed chicken. I might add that's not cooked. When most of us, if we're going to spend $20 on chicken, we do it at a KFC and we get, a 12-piece bucket with mashed potatoes and green beans. And I do think that there's a significantly better way for us to help agriculture in this by simply adopting best practices in parity with our producers and helping with the increased cost of that. So my concern with where this is taking us is that there's going to be a value created out of thin air that's going to provide very little for the farmer or the environment, and then a whole bunch of people that don't have anything to do with agriculture are going to be getting the money. And with that, Mr. Chairman, is that acceptable?
Yes, it is. The gentlewoman. I didn't yield it. The gentlewoman from Maine, Ms. Pingree, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing. I think this is a really important topic, and there's a lot to say and not a lot of time to say it, so I'll try to be quick. I think it's couple things before I ask my question. I do think it's really important we don't muddy the waters here between voluntary and mandatory carbon markets, compliance markets. This is about voluntary markets, and really most of the witnesses have dealt with that, and I appreciate that. And just quickly, I think it's very difficult to use an example for 2020. I love the programs that California is doing, and I know they have a lot of great work going, but the changes in these markets from 2010 to today is enormous. And I think we have to talk about what we're dealing with now and the huge interest in the voluntary markets that's going on right now. So I just want to put that out there. But first I want to ask Ms. Reed, thank you so much for your testimony. We've heard a lot of the witnesses talk about scaling up and refining the Farm Bill conservation programs, and I'm pleased to hear that there's so much agreement on that, and that's really one of the reasons why it's such an important part of the Build Back Better program, because we do need to invest more. But I want to talk about all the tools that we can use. So we know those things are really important to our carbon sequestration, but could you talk a little bit more about how those two work together, these voluntary ecosystem services markets and the role they play in our broader strategy of conservation programs and what we're talking about today?
Yes, thank you, Representative Pingree. Nice to see you, and thanks for the question. So these voluntary markets are entirely complementary to USDA conservation programs. As a matter of fact, those conservation programs are a form of upfront financing to help farmers and ranchers actually participate in the markets, which can bring an additional income stream. We do view them as a form of upfront financing, and we feel that USDA conservation and technical assistance is essential to farmers and ranchers to have place-based assistance to help them be successful. So again, they're entirely complementary and a new and additional opportunity, if you will, to invest in climate smart practices. And I think the reason that companies are investing as well in both of those opportunity sets is because the practices we are trying to increase at scale actually make farmers and ranchers more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So all of them together are really win-win opportunities for producers.
Great. And thanks for talking about the importance of the resilience for farmers, because we do want to make sure all of our farmers both get that extra income stream, but have these resilient practices. So a couple more quick questions to Ms. Eidberg from the EDF. Thank you so much for your testimony here today. It's been touched on a little bit, and I think everybody's very concerned about the lack of uniformity. So if you want to just say a couple things about what happens if the USDA doesn't play a role, as this is increasingly becoming the Wild West out there, and there's a lot of different systems, and it does need to be managed differently. And if you could just throw in one other thing that I'm concerned about. I deal with a lot of organic farmers, sustainable farmers who have been using these practices for a long time. Mr. Milligan from the wheat growers mentioned it. How do we recognize those farmers that already have good practices going to make sure that what they've been doing in the past isn't, left set aside?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. If USDA doesn't get involved, and I would actually even hedge and say that it doesn't necessarily have to be USDA. It could be, another neutral third party. But if we don't have a referee on the field, we don't have someone, setting standards and providing consistent measurement, farmers are probably going to get the short end of the stick. They need to be able to have a consistent target to shoot for, and then buyers want to make sure that the credits that they are buying are quality credits and are not going to be eliminated or discounted later. So I think for the protection of farmers, we have to have that referee out there. Second, in dealing with early adopters, this is a really challenging place. I think that, I'll go back to the Food and Agricultural Climate Alliance that EDF is a part of. This is something that our organizations have wrestled with. We think there are some options out there. Our specific recommendation, and I know that there are other ones out there, but our specific recommendation was to do one-time payments to farmers who are early adopters, and then make sure that they are continuously enrolled in some sort of state or federal or other approved conservation program. So there are innovative and I think different ways we could think about it, but it is extremely important.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really do appreciate this conversation today.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Spingray. And now I recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and certainly thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing here today. Grateful for your testimony and the opportunity to hear your answers to this subject as how we can best help our U.S. farmers. No one cares more about the land than this nation's farmers and ranchers. They depend on healthy soil to feed and clothe our country. When it comes to carbon markets and the farmers in my district, the number one priority is that any programs remain voluntary. Overburdensome government regulations create costly and time-consuming barriers for hardworking members of our agricultural community. I'm a firm believer that the private marketplace will best regulate itself. There are still a lot of questions to be answered when it comes to the carbon stored in soil becoming its own commodity crop. Congress must ensure any legislation passed does not pick winners and losers and ultimately hinder innovation and stifle competition. Mr. Milligan, in your testimony, you listed 11 questions you frequently hear from growers. Considering the lack of full understanding of these emerging markets, do you think it's premature for the federal government to get involved?
I think that as we've discussed this, and we have a special committee at National Association of Wheat Growers, and we feel the government would have a very prominent place in establishing some standards, so we have uniform standards across the industry, and maybe a few other guidelines as science. What's carbon look like? How do you measure it? It's a Wild West field out there. Yes, I think there is a place to set some uniformity and some standards.
Do you think Congress should divert USDA resources for new programs to stand up carbon markets?
We feel that voluntary works well, and I think the private has an opportunity to step in and fill that need. Yeah,
I find it's been rare occasion that the federal government does much better in anything than the private sector can do, and certainly I trust our farmers who are actually in the field like yourself to make better decisions. Currently, what is the largest barrier to participation in these markets for wheat growers and more broadly other agriculture producers?
I think it's the unknown. I have not had personal experience with it. I know some of our growers have. The dollar amounts out there have not been, I think, fell way short of what the cost might be involved. There are some long-term commitments that people have asked for that certainly people are very hesitant to get into. It's the uncertainty.
So that wouldn't necessarily indicate that this hearing is premature, but possibly any action that was taken in this time frame would be premature and be harmful to the ag community. Would you agree with that?
It's a work in progress.
And any idea what kind of time frame it would take to undertake something of this magnitude?
It's a little above my pay grade.
Yeah, but anything that usually is rushed by our government tends not to work out very well, and it seems like we're in a big rush. We have a lot of pressing issues that we need to be discussing right now, including our role in oversight. But I appreciate we're moving forward with hearings. It's good to have this conversation. I think it's a little premature and seems to be driven by a bigger agenda, but I thank you for your answers and your time here, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. And now the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I appreciate you holding this hearing on carbon markets. Given the weather events that happened across our country this summer, whether it was wildfires or floods or hurricanes, I do not believe that this is too soon to be talking about the impact of carbon on the changes to our climate, particularly for farmers with the droughts and the very heavy rains. It's been a very, very challenging time. So I believe the crisis of climate change requires an all-hands-on-deck approach, and all viable solutions must be on the table, including carbon markets for farmers and foresters. I've talked to farmers and foresters across New Hampshire, and I've been deeply impressed by all that they are already doing to adopt climate-smart practices and make their lands effective carbon sinks. Many are doing this on their own initiative. Farmers know all too well their livelihoods are on the line with the threats of climate change and extreme weather. I had hail on my deck this summer in New Hampshire that was several inches deep, and it harmed the apples at the orchard right down the road from my house. So these are fantastic USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service programs that support our efforts and provide valuable technical assistance to producers to cope with these extreme weather events. As private carbon markets grow, I can see these are valuable opportunities to further strengthen the agriculture sector's conservation work and carbon capture potential. In fact, it's one of the main reasons that I came back to the Agriculture Committee this session. It's also important that we continue to reduce and eliminate emissions by buying credits to offset them. And I'm concerned that small farmers and forest operations will have limited access to participate in carbon markets. It's important, as the witness said, that these markets have rigorous protocols and oversight to ensure effectiveness. But often this can be burdensome for smaller farmers, like the farmers in my state that have limited time and resources to meet those requirements. Entities looking to purchase carbon credits need to see the value of working with family farmers and our homegrown foresters. As we advance solutions to address the climate crisis, we need to make sure no one is left out or left behind. So I have a question for Mr. Antonioli. Thank you for being here to talk about the work that Verra is doing as the world's largest carbon crediting verifier program. I'm curious about what you see in terms of small farms and forests participating in the carbon markets that you certified. And beyond the demands of compliance process, what do you see as the biggest barriers to small producer participation? How can we help address this in Congress?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And those are very, very good questions. I think that I want to point out one thing and emphasize a little bit about what you said about the evolution of the carbon markets. They are very different than what they were back in the day. Even I was a skeptic of agricultural carbon credits because I didn't think that the ability to be able to demonstrate the soil carbon sequestration was there. But over time, we've seen that the science has evolved, technology has evolved. There's a much better understanding of the non-carbon credits, the non-carbon benefits, and there's increased growing demand, which I think will help the small farmers. I mean, this isn't a solution that's going to work for everybody, but it is another option, and it is a complement to what farmers have available. And if the markets continue to grow and we start to see continued higher prices, that's going to inevitably be another option for farmers that's going to let them do that. Another really important element that I think is worth bearing in mind is that farmers can step into this slowly. It's not that you have to turn your entire farm to the regenerative agricultural practices all of a sudden, all at once. You can step into it at part of your field. You can do it on a stepwise approach in terms of the practices that you implement. And so that the idea there, and I think this really goes down to how we've been thinking and the market's been thinking about how to create the protocols and the methodologies to allow farmers to step into this slowly in a way that gives them the confidence they need. And then once they realize the benefits, they can continue to expand that. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you. My time is very limited. So just quickly, Mr. Loma, can you speak to how participation in private carbon markets has helped your company and others provide good stewardship of our forests with enhanced financial viability?
Yeah, thank you, Representative, for the question. It's a good question. As we've been talking about right along on the agriculture side, the same holds true on the forestry side in terms of voluntary participation.
The time has expired, excuse me, but we're on a tight schedule, and an answer could be provided in writing if you don't mind, but we're on a tight schedule. We want to get everybody in. Now I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. I have a question for Mr. Loma. Obviously, we've had plenty of wildfire out in the West and are running into issues of the burn scar basically affecting just about everything. So in order to protect the carbon credits, we need to have the asset that has been set aside as a credit area continue to exist. So, but the fires don't distinguish between these boundaries. So carbon credit areas can be affected by fire. So one known as the Colville IFM project has burned during what's called the bootleg fire. This happens to be on the Oregon side, but there is many, many acres up there. I believe what added up in, as far as offsets is in terms of tons was 14 million tons of offset just this last August on the bootleg fire that was used in a California market for carbon compliance. So what happens in the situation where basically a set aside area dedicated to the carbon capture carbon market, if that burns in a wildfire situation like we did have in this forested area, then what's the liability for those that bought the credits or for those who are the landowners that participated in the project and are sort of as the holder of the credit, if that makes sense? You know, when you have a natural disaster like that, how do we sort that out?
Yeah, thank you, Representative LaMalfa. I appreciate the question. And there's no question that the concern over the fire situation out west is concerning to all of us. Thankfully, we don't deal with that so much in the South or in the Midwest, or even in the Northeast. I'm not an expert on how the carbon markets are working out there, but I would suggest that as we continue to study improvements in the way we would implement these markets, that we would have alternatives to cover the carbon that has been identified for credits across a larger forested landscape, so that a particular tract of land if it's been designated for carbon storage and carbon credits, if something happens to that, like in fire or pathogens, that there are alternatives that can be brought into play. What I think is most important, though, is this notion that working forests need to continue to work. And there's lots of opportunities for identifying alternative carbon storage sources across the working forest. And maybe
Mr. Loma, again, our time goes so fast, and I'm sorry about that. But I appreciate that thought that the forest needs to continue to be working in order to be effective on that. If we just dedicate it as a set aside and then never touch it once again, you're going to have the same problem we have in a lot of the forested areas. So it has to be a working landscape, I think, and no matter if it's a set aside or not. So, but could you maybe offline give us some more ideas on what the alternatives are? Because you have X amount of acres set aside for this carbon credit area, and it did burn. We'd probably have to have something more defined as what the alternative would be. We can't have maybe 2 blocks of land in order to do it in case one burns. I don't know if that would be practical. So let me thank you, Mr. Loma. Let me ask Ms. Merrill here. You mentioned that since I think 2003, the different carbon markets have proved themselves basically inadequate to reach the different farmers and ranchers due to pricing, that the carbon market developed a protocol, for example, for rice growers, which I happen to be and have lived firsthand, that rice producers haven't taken advantage of it, haven't participated because it just doesn't add up. And we've experienced that with rice straw disposal and all sorts of things over the years that have, it never gets back to the farmer. It's the people in between. So what could you emphasize would be a better path forward for getting more grower participation so they can actually benefit and be more enthusiastic about it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We've seen certainly with the climate smart agriculture programs in California, which are modeled after the USDA Farm Bill conservation programs, that's an approach that works. The voluntary carbon market that's currently in place, pays pennies or up to $15 per metric ton of CO2 sequestered. But when we compare, for example, we looked at a farmer in your neck of the woods in Butte County who signed up for a Healthy Soils grant.
I'm sorry, but your time has expired. It's very important that every member, I want to get in, and votes will be coming up shortly. So we want to have a tight schedule so we can get everybody in. I appreciate that. Now I will recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Bustos, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on General Farm Commodities and Risk Management. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Ms. Bustos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we've heard from our witnesses, there are several private carbon markets that are currently in operation. And I wanted to highlight a recent announcement by Indigo Ag and Growmark, which is an Illinois-based farmer-owned cooperative that will create additional opportunities for farmers across the Midwest to participate in a carbon market. So Indigo Ag is one of the first companies to initiate a carbon market, providing much needed flexibility for farmers to meet outcomes-based targets. They've worked extensively on credits that are high quality and, very important, independently verified. So this, combined with Growmark's large network and the relationship with their grower customers, it creates an exciting opportunity for farmers to generate additional revenue by implementing climate smart practices that sequester carbon and improve water quality and biodiversity. Quality is the beneficial link between farmers and buyers, and it's proven to lift prices 35% over the past year. And as we all know, a critical component of building private carbon markets is for buyers to know and to trust that the credits generated are fully verified and based on strong measurement protocols. So I've got a statement here that I would ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record. If we could do that before I ask a question here.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So now, Mr. Bastos, and I like your name, it's very similar to mine with one letter difference. Could you share how Bayer determined the price it will pay farmers for these credits? Mr. Bastos, you're muted, sir.
Oh,
Mr.
Thank you. If you could start again, please.
Yeah, so Congresswoman Bustos, thank you for the question. The way we determine the price is actually based on public information from multiple companies and also the reference related to nature-based solutions in the market, right? So we know that today nature-based solutions is actually ranging from a price between $15 to $25. So that's how we actually have as a parameter for how much we're expecting to get paid from those credits, and therefore how much you can actually afford, discounting the costs that take to verify those credits back to the farmer.
So what if the price of carbon increases during the term of a contract?
That is exactly like what we have as a provision in our contract. As prices increase, we actually share more of that value back to the farmer.
And then can the credit price be adjusted then?
Yes.
Okay, and how about if the price of the carbon decreases? What happens then?
We honor the contract with the farmer, and we keep paying the amount that we actually initially agreed upon.
Okay. Thank you very much for that clarification. Mr. Antonioli, most agricultural carbon markets seek new greenhouse gas reductions or new carbon sequestration. Farmers and ranchers who are already implementing climate smart practices, these early adopters, so to speak, are often either ineligible to participate in carbon programs or can't financially benefit from generating carbon credits. My question to you, sir, is should carbon markets consider or compensate early adopters? And if so, if you could explain how you think that should be done.
Thank you, Congresswoman. It's a very good question, and we've already discussed that topic. And but I wanted to emphasize that I think there are creative ways of solving that. But in the end of the day, I mean, organizations like us, we do need to certify the additional carbon that is generated. Maybe there's other ways that you can compensate for farmers who are already doing the right thing. But from a carbon crediting perspective, it is important that we ensure that we're crediting only additional and new carbon sequestration. Now, there is one element that's important, that the practices that are being implemented or that can be credited kind of are additional, and you may already do no-till farming, maybe you're doing some cover crops, but there are other things that you can do to continue to generate more carbon. So that's one of the really great innovations that we've seen in the market, that you're able to add on more management practices to continue to add to the carbon in the soil, and that you can get credit for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back my remaining 12 seconds.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And getting back to the point of staying on subject, if you could put out some type of a rule about what we can address and what we can address so that we can hold both sides accountable, I think that would be in order. So if your staff or you and the ranking member could get together and set about those rules about what we could talk about, and then how we object to others and their comments, and how we can stop this rhetoric on both sides, then I think that would be the fair way to go about things. With all due respect, you are the chairman, and I respect you and love you and want to see this committee succeed, but it's very difficult under these circumstances to do this. But from the standpoint of this hearing, I've done as much research, and my staff has done as much research as we can about this, and it is a very complex subject, as is climate change, because I'm skeptical of this whole business because a lot of folks making a lot of money, and the thing that really bothers me is that our farmers have provided oxygen through their timber and their crops to this country, and yet now we're talking about, hey, we're going to incentivize you to do more. We're going to pay you for more, but we're not going to pay you for what you've already done, because we know that over the last, and there's no question that over the last 50, 100 years, I mean, just 50 years ago, 98% of the population was in agribusiness, lived on the family farm. And now we have these huge cities with traffic problems and everything else that are contributing enormously. And then you got big tech. I mean, look what big tech is contributing to the carbon footprint and everything that they manufacture, all the electricity they use, air conditioning. Air conditioning is another one. And then, of course, air travel is another one. So, you know, as our society has changed, we've got to adapt to it and deal with these things. But here we go back to the farmer, and our farmers, like I said, I'm skeptical about this thing because, as we've seen many times, the government gets involved, and then these large corporations get to go out and say, hey, I'm carbon neutral because I'm paying a farmer 10 cents on the dollar to produce oxygen. So, you know, my question is, do any of the witnesses feel qualified to give a defense of these markets? And how in good conscience I can go to, say, my timber growers and encourage them to engage in markets from which they would likely only receive a very small percentage of exactly the value of what they're creating. Would anyone have the expertise to explain that to me?
I'd be happy to, Congressman Allen. This is Debbie Reed. I'll point out that markets pay for new product, just like markets will pay for corn or soy that is generated on an annual basis. These markets are paying for new product. I think that is an important distinction, right? Why markets rules prevent you from paying for something that happened in the past. I do think, though, that brings up a great point, is that USDA, if they set up a carbon bank, could in fact pay early adopters through that carbon bank. I think that would be an excellent value to reward growers, including farmers and ranchers and foresters who have in fact done something in the past, because we all as society do benefit from those outcomes, as you point out. We benefit every day from them. So I think that's a perfect public role that is perhaps different than what a private voluntary market could do.
But again, Americans, when we think of secondary markets, of course, you know, they have to be heavily regulated. You know, there's a lot of irresponsibility and fraud in these markets that these corporations have been hiding for years, like derivatives and all these other things, and some with nationwide and extreme ramifications. And you know, again, we talked about the value of this, and how do we offset the value with what we be able to do when we can't even measure it, as I understand it. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And now I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garbahal. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all our witnesses that came here today. Agriculture practices and land management decisions play a key role in the discussions surrounding global greenhouse emissions and climate policy. Keeping farmers and ranchers in production is vital to food and, of course, our national security. We must make strides in sustainability while keeping food on the table. And it is essential that we do so in a way that supports small and medium-scale farms in gaining entry to carbon markets. Mr. Reed, what resources can the government use to ensure that opportunities to participate in agricultural carbon markets are inclusive to a diverse range of farmers? And are there existing federal programs that could be utilized to resolve potential participation barriers?
Yes, thank you, Representative Carbajal, for the question. I think the answer is yes. USDA technical assistance to help farmers and ranchers understand which management changes they can undertake so that their outcomes on an annual basis can be measured and then valued in the market is the best, perhaps, utilization of their resources to really provide that on-the-ground technical assistance for farmers and ranchers. I think there's also been some discussion about USDA conservation programs, which do the same thing and provide a form of upfront financing as well as technical assistance for farmers and ranchers to understand in their region and for their own production systems the best actions they can take that work within the context of their farm or ranching system. We don't want to try to impose any one-size-fits-all requirements on farmers and ranchers. We want them to do the things that actually work best for them. And I think that is the best utilization of USDA resources in those two arenas.
Thank you very much. The next question that I have is for Ms. Idleberg. Farms, ranches, and forests in my Central Coast District are on the front lines of climate change. Each year, extreme weather events and drought continue to threaten my community and the environment around it. Carbon markets have the potential to deliver other critical environmental benefits beyond carbon sequestration and GHG emission reductions. Ms. Otterberg, can you speak to what other benefits we might see from carbon markets?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. You know, and it's been mentioned here today that diversity in income is a potential benefit of voluntary markets. But on the agronomic side of things, you know, the practices that are incentivized by markets and by the conservation programs at USDA, you know, increase soil fertility, increase the ability of soil to retain water in a flood situation. I mean, those are the key, you know, co-benefits that we're looking for these conservation practices to provide. In California, where you've got water in short supply, you need that soil to be able to maintain every bit of moisture that it can. And using these conservation practices can provide that co-benefit to the farmer and to that field so that they're able to stay in business for much longer than we might project now.
Thank you. Ms. Reed, what can we do? What additional measures, what additional outreach can be conducted to incentivize and to reach out to more farmers and ranchers interested in participating in carbon markets throughout our country and certainly the Central Coast that I represent?
Yes, thank you. I think in the Central Coast in particular, what we need is more data actually for specialty crops. We don't have a lot of information about specialty crops and really how to quantify the impacts of improved management practices in specialty crops. I think that's one major thing that USDA could do is additional research there and additional support in those production systems for whether it's wine grape growers, for instance, or almond orchards to understand what practices make them more resilient and can improve soil carbon sequestration and water holding capacity, et cetera. I think additionally, though, farmers and ranchers need to understand what are the roles and responsibilities they take on when they participate in these markets so that they have a very clear vision of what is going to be required of them.
Pardon me, time has expired. You can provide an answer in writing.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Baird, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking member. And, you know, I think we all recognize that this is an emerging market and it may be appropriate, or I think it's appropriate that we have this discussion and kind of get a sense of what programs are working in this market. And so having said that, Mr. Milligan, in your testimony, you expressed concern that many producers continue to have questions about the carbon markets and the impact of those on the farms, and that not all protocols will work in every situation. And so I hear frequently from my producers that all practices may not work for all operations. So, for example, livestock producers may have a different need and so on than crop producers. So do you have any suggestions how we can account for differences in geographic or soil or other operations differences that may otherwise prevent producers or enhance producers' ability to participate in these programs?
Thank you for the question. You raise a very valid point. We did try to emphasize that in our conversation earlier about the diversity and the rainfall. I think it gets back to it's going to be a lot more research, I think, that's going to be involved, whether it's from the land-grant universities, you know, the mainstream that fits all. There may be some guidelines, some things out there for them, but as we get into these different environments that are not quite as plentiful, you know, they've been passed by on the research. I think we need some more research and science, sound science behind these practices in these areas.
Absolutely, I agree with your thought about additional research, and I appreciate a science-based kind of decisions. But you know, in that same vein, how do you think we handle if a landowner has land and somebody else is renting it? How do we handle those relationships on who gets paid?
I'm not sure I'm capable of answering that question. That question is a very valid question. It's been raised. Maybe some of the people in the common market that are in the carbon market might have some insight on that, but that is certainly a factor going ahead.
Thank you. So I have a last question. You know, I think agriculture, and we've kind of focused on some of that here today, is a shining light and has some real potential to be involved in this carbon market. And then I mentioned livestock just a little bit earlier. So Mr. Antonelli, did I pronounce that close? Well, and Ms. Reed, this has to do with dairy operations and the use of methane digesters and so on. So what steps do you think we could do that would be helpful to get this challenge and help dairy producers participate in these programs?
Yeah. Thank you, Congressman Baird, for the question. So there's a few things that dairy producers can do. Obviously, they can do digesters. There's obviously a fairly strong carbon market led by California that's actually incentivizing the creation of digesters to treat the waste. There are new technologies and new approaches that are being brought onto the market. For example, there's a new technology that is an additive to feed that reduces the methane from enteric fermentation. And so the carbon markets are great at fostering that kind of innovation. And to relate to your previous question, you're thinking about different lands. I mean, right now, the current approaches might be limited to certain lands and certain types of activities. But over time, as the markets evolve, if people start to see that there are other opportunities, new crops, new activities, new practices that can be done, those can be folded into the carbon markets and continue to drive that innovation.
Yeah, thank you. I would add to that. So we have a dairy project in California, which we're doing a whole farm approach. So it includes a methane digester. It includes looking at feed production for the actual dairy cows and how we can reduce the footprint of feed production. It includes some new feed additives, as David pointed out, that I think will really show positive ability to reduce methane from both enteric emissions from the dairy cows, but also they're utilizing new technologies to convert manure into soil amendment products that will help increase soil carbon on the farm for the feed that is being grown. So we're looking at whole farm, whole landscape approaches, and then we're looking at water quality and water use conservation on the farm so that we can really look at the entire footprint and all of the beneficial impacts.
I appreciate all your responses, and I could go on for additional time on this, but my time is up. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Schreier, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing on such an important topic. Farmers and ranchers are right at the front lines of the climate crisis. They are feeling the effects, and across the country, droughts, fires, and floods are affecting their livelihoods. Carbon markets are one tool that we have to address and mitigate the growing threat of climate change. And as I've heard, not all solutions work for all types of farms, but this is one tool we have. They have the potential to make an impact and have garnered broad bipartisan support, but they do need to be implemented really thoughtfully to ensure that they result in long-lasting carbon sequestration. First, I'd love to talk about forests, which have an enormous potential to sequester carbon. And I am from Washington State. As conventional agriculture works to develop and implement regenerative practices in carbon markets, forests have greater carbon storage potential right now in the near term. And increasing forest carbon sequestration is simple. It is based in evidence-based forest management. And while there are often high barriers to entry into these markets, we know what the right practices are: hazardous fuels management, reforestation, and an active wood products industry. In addition to the carbon storage benefits, implementing these practices both on public and private lands also has the potential to reduce the frequency and severity of wildfires and provides ecologic benefits such as improved wildlife habitat. Now, traditional threats to forests like wildfire still pose risks to the forestry carbon market, and disease can rapidly erase years of progress. And that's why active and aggressive forest management is key to mitigate these potential risks, make our forests more resilient, and prevent them from releasing carbon as opposed to sequestering it. We just need an all hands on deck approach to forest management. And that's why I introduced the National Prescribed Fire Act to increase federal investment in prescribed burns as a pre-season wildfire mitigation strategy. Also helps secure $60 million in this year's budget for the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. And I'm working with local stakeholders in my district to bring a small diameter sawmill to Central Washington, where 85% of one of my counties is forested. I also want to note that private companies are interested in offsetting their carbon footprint, and they understand that the potential that forests hold and are driving the demand for carbon credits from forests. These companies don't just want to invest in forests; they also want to invest in forest sustainability and make sure this is done right. I have some questions for Brian Luoma. Mr. Luoma, in your testimony, you mentioned the challenge of increasing participation and confidence in foreign carbon markets. From your perspective, how can Congress support this effort, and what role do you see the federal government playing in forestry markets specifically?
Yeah, thank you, Representative, and I agree with everything you just said, and congratulations on the legislation. We need to continue to define what the opportunities are in this market, and supporting funding in the USDA with the FIA and the Forest Products Lab, and the grant programs where we can do research and do analysis and understand better what's at play in the full life cycle analysis all the way to the built environment. From seedling all the way through to seedling, if you will. There's a tremendous amount of carbon to be sequestered and stored in the forest while it's working, and then moved into the built environment where it gets stored for a long time. We don't know a whole lot about how to do the accounting for that. A lot of people are working on it, but I think funding within the USDA to help us do research there will be very helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the question, how long will that cross-laminated timber building remain? Because at some point wood degrades or is brought down, and we're looking at 100-year solutions. Now, given that 40% of US forests are publicly owned, what opportunities do you see for public-private partnership in the forestry carbon offset market space?
Yeah, again, I think that's a discussion that can be had within the USDA and within all of the organizations that are working on this now, including the Environmental Defense Fund and the Nature Conservancy. There is a lot of collaboration now on the principle.
The gentleman can respond with a letter. Thank you. And now, gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Finstra is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Scott, and thank you, Ranking Member Thompson. I just want to give a shout out to all our farmers and producers around the country. I am absolutely so proud of them. I am so proud of what they have done when it comes to our environment. Sometimes they get vilified by environmentalists, And I just want to tell everyone, they're doing an amazing job. My district is probably 1 or 2 in the nation when it comes to production and agriculture. And we're doing all these things. You know, we're doing no-till, we're doing cover crops, we're doing nutrient management. And when I hear these conversations, I get concerned about are they going to be part of the solution when it comes to helping them? When discussing carbon markets, the farmers in my district, they have a lot of interest. With that, they have several questions. One of these questions is, like I said, they're doing all these great practices. Now, are they going to be compensated for these practices as we move forward? And I would ask Mr. Bastos if you could answer that question.
Thank you, Representative, for the question. And I think we debated, a little bit today about, the idea and the challenge that we have in terms of early adopters in the market. We in Bayer, we actually have in our program, a way that we actually compensate those early adopters. But I would say that carbon markets and offsets are pretty much one type of solution. I think there are other solutions in that space related to the food value chain, for example, in terms of creating sustainably sourced products that can actually help those farmers be compensated for the service that they do. So my point is, offsets is one part of the solution, but there are other tools that these farmers can actually participate and be compensated for the service that they provide to agriculture and to the environment.
Thank you for that. In my district, there are carbon capture and storage projects that will sequester carbon directly from fertilizer plants, ethanol plants, never letting the carbon go into the atmosphere. I'm supportive of these projects and 45Q tax credits that encourages this type of construction. This is for any witness. As companies work to reduce carbon emissions on their own, what does that mean for the future of carbon credits? Is there a viable market for farmers and producers in the long term when you have the private sector doing something like this?
Thank you, Congressman. It's a great question. I think there is a viable market in the long term, but I think you point to something that's very important, that there are companies taking responsibility for their own emissions first. And that's, in terms of the role of the voluntary carbon markets, they're meant to be complementary to those internal reductions. The voluntary markets are growing, they will continue to grow, but they will also complement the activities that companies are doing to reduce their own internal emissions, which is perhaps the bigger part of the solution or the challenge.
Yes, I would add to that in that I think what you are seeing, the huge growth in markets, is because we now have every sector actually acting to reduce their emissions, and every industry that operates across those sectors doing that. So the increased demand extends into the agricultural and farming and ranching, if you will, supply chain. So there is huge demand, and I think that demand will only go up.
Thank you for those comments. Thank you very much. As farmers look to engage in the carbon markets, my priority is to ensure that the farmers are empowered and have the technical advice needed to make these decisions. This is so important. Farmers succeed when there is certainty and transparency in any marketplace. While many have interest in the carbon markets, farmers are hesitant because of so much confusion. Mr. Milligan, in your testimony, you highlighted similar concerns for wheat growers. I'm wondering, from your perspective, can growers, what are some of the biggest barriers that we should be concerned about, and how do we rectify them?
The biggest barrier seems to still be the sound science behind what's actually out there in the market. And of course, wheat is so diverse, it's grown in so many different areas that wheat is kind of unique to the mainstream crops.
Yes, David.
If I may, Congressman, I realize that to answer your previous question, it's really important to note that farmers, in terms of soil carbon, generate what we call removals of carbon from the atmosphere. And there's a very long-term market for those. There's a fairly limited supply of those kinds of credits in the market today. And as we move towards 2050, when the world is looking at achieving net zero targets, the removals will be a critical part of the question. So
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Bishop, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for holding this hearing. It is indeed very timely with the climate challenges with which we are faced. And as indicated, our farmers are among the greatest stewards of our environment. I want to follow up on something that Mr. Finstra touched on, and I think it has to do with the concept of additionality for early adopters. Some of the risk associated with carbon markets as they are currently structured is that the early adopters, like the organic peanut farmers and others in my district who've been practicing climate-smart agriculture for decades, and those who participate in the USDA conservation programs like EQIP, could possibly be excluded from participating because the carbon sequestration and the storage benefits from their operations are already baked into the baseline. So in effect, early adopters could feel that they are penalized because they've been doing the right thing. So I was encouraged to see that Bayer Carbon Initiative provides compensation to producers for up to 5 years of past practices on or after January 1st, 2012. But only 17 states are currently participating in the program. So I'd like for Mr. Bastos to talk to us a little bit about the concept of additionality and why Bayer decided to make the payments eligible for past practices. And I'd like to know also if he feels that it would be helpful for USDA to provide incentives similar to those that Bayer is providing for early adopters, and if that would be helpful.
Thank you for the question, Congressman Bishop. The concept of additionality is one that we actually discussed today about, like, implementing these practices. Actually, it happens because there is a incentive to implement a project, right, related to carbon, and it wouldn't have occurred otherwise. So we actually have in our program this 5-year, let's say, payment, and that's kind of like in sync with some of the standards actually represented by Mr. Antonioli here today. So that's how we actually approach the program. And the other things related to incentives, I think that my personal point of view on this is incentives are always helpful, but I think they need to be in sync with, like, what carbon markets actually require. Otherwise, to your point, they can be excluded if additional incentives come on top of the current incentives of the market, and they're not well designed to meet the additionality criteria.
Thank you very much. Mr. Antonioli, switching gears slightly, the Family Forest Carbon Program connects family forest owners with trusted information and professionals, and it pays them for implementing carbon-positive forest management practices. The House Ag Committee just passed a bill to provide similar incentives for small forest landowners. Vera is responsible for developing the methodology for this program. In addition to the Family Forest Carbon Program, it provides corporations with a platform to reach their critical environmental and economic goals. It wasn't covered in your testimony, but the American Forest Foundation considers it a priority to support small forest landowners in accessing carbon markets. Can you talk more about the importance of supporting small farmers and forest landowners?
Yes, sir, Congressman. It's a great point. And that is one of the challenges that the carbon markets have been facing, is how do you actually make it accessible to the small landholders and the small forest owners, because they tend to be smaller and they have fewer resources at their disposal. So we are working actively with the American Forest Foundation to try to figure out how to really create a new methodology, if you will, to enable that. The recently approved methodology for soil carbon is a good example of how you create something that's scalable and that is accessible to small farmers. Of course, the price is critical. The higher the price, the more that you can actually, have available to be able to make the practices happen on the ground. It's an ongoing challenge. And it's something that we consider always, and we're working towards that.
Thank you very much. My time is about up. I'll yield my remaining 13 seconds back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady from Louisiana, Ms. Letlow, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Thompson, thank you for facilitating this hearing to discuss and most importantly learn from a full panel of witnesses regarding voluntary carbon markets in the agriculture industry. To all the witnesses, your time and insight provided here today has been invaluable as we, members of this committee, continue the review and oversight of policies that have been introduced to this Congress. I'd like to start my remarks by echoing what many of my colleagues have stressed before me. Our farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners are the pioneers of conservation and sustainability on our productive lands. There are numerous factors that agriculturalists have to consider when planning for a new season, and those decisions ultimately impact the vitality of our soils for future growing seasons. Whether it's adopting new practices, implementing new technologies, or mitigating for potential risks, farmers are the forefront of innovation, and they work hard every day to preserve the land for generations to come. It's essential that we recognize these successes of our farmers and the standing USDA conservation programs, and ensure our agricultural communities are the true beneficiaries as we continue to build upon these efforts. Agriculture is a very diversified industry. Regions have different growing seasons, climates, production practices, and risks. What works for the Southeast generally does not apply to the Pacific Northwest. Mr. Milligan, in your written testimony, you provided several scenarios where a one-size-fits-all approach isn't feasible for just one crop. That is wheat. Similarly, no-till, cover crops, and other basic conservation practices don't fit more niche commodities like rice, crawfish, sugar, and others in my home state of Louisiana. I know you touched on this briefly in response to my colleague, Mr. Braid's questioning, but can you further elaborate on the challenges presented by a single carbon market system on such a diversified industry? Secondly, in your experience, what would be the best approach to make these types of programs more inclusive and equitable for all commodities and across different crop mixes?
I believe that question was for you, Mr. Milligan.
Excuse me. Sorry for that. Thank you for the question. It's a real challenge, as you mentioned, and I think I mentioned earlier, when you get to diverse crops, we have some specialty crops in our area too. You mentioned rice, and I think it's still back to there needs to be more research, whether it's land-grant universities, but they certainly want to be a part, I think. I think, you know, when I speak about wheat, we feel that wheat growers are doing a good job, but we feel we can do a better job. And I think that pretty much sums up what it would be for a lot of these other commodities. I think there certainly is an interest in there to do the right thing and to be compensated for it, but certainly we've got to have the sound science to back it up.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question for Mr. Bastos. I understand your company has some experience in this space given Bayer's own carbon program. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman Letlow. So I would emphasize some of the topics here. I think research is actually definitely fundamental, right, for us to actually evolve into multiple crops, multiple systems, and even different geographies. But we have to start somewhere, and I think that there's never a bad time to actually start somewhere, especially in climate change. So we think that it's a stepwise process. You know, we start where we actually can have an impact, and then by having an impact, that creates some kind of like, you know, better outcomes for the market. Market gets excited. There's a new innovation, new technologies that allow this other farmers and other crops to actually jump in and participate. So I think it's a starting point. And us as a company, we're actually doing the same thing. We all work with multiple farmers, multiple crops, but we actually have to start somewhere, and that's what we're doing today with the Bayer Carbon Program.
Thank you so much to the witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Nutrition, Oversight, and Department Operations. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Ms. Hayes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to be here today discussing carbon markets and their potential to help in our fight against climate change. It is increasingly clear that our farmers, especially our small family farms with high costs of operation and slim profit margins, are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Not only are they tasked with mitigating their own carbon emissions, but they must withstand more frequent natural disasters caused by carbon emissions of the past. While carbon markets could be an effective piece of a larger strategy to fight climate change, we must ensure that we are putting family farms at the center of our conversations and not treating them as an afterthought. Connecticut family farms have long led the way in climate smart policies and are steadfast in their commitment to stewardship over the land for future generations. Many farms in the district that I represent have proactively implemented the use of cover crops, rotational grazing, no-till farming, and agroforestry. It is our duty not only to provide our small farmers with the resources they need, but to adapt and sustain climate smart policies, and also to ensure we explore every opportunity to make the agriculture industry a leader in the fight in this climate crisis. Carbon markets, if done well, will make farmers in my districts part of the solution. Ms. Edinburgh, my question is directed to you. In your testimony, you mentioned that USDA should ensure equitable access to markets. Can you elaborate on how USDA can ensure that small farmers have access to carbon markets?
Sure. Thank you for the question. You know, carbon markets or voluntary greenhouse gas markets can be confusing. They can be complicated. We've already heard other witnesses and members of Congress talk about some of the challenges, contracts that are 100 years or more. These are all barriers for producers to participate. Getting USDA involved, setting some standards that everyone can work towards, making sure that we're bringing down the cost of the measurement and verification so that smaller farms can participate in these scenarios. I think those are all really good places for and really good roles for USDA to play. I heard one of our other panelists earlier talking about conservation programs at USDA as a way for farmers to start this process, kind of that upfront capital so they can potentially engage later. So that is an opportunity. But I also think that at USDA, we have an opportunity to provide really strong technical assistance to those farmers who need this work, and making sure that we're supporting those on-the-ground resources in every district and every county to every farmer is incredibly important.
Well, thank you. You've actually answered my next question, which was what existing federal policies do to either help or exacerbate some of the challenges of farmers. So I'm very happy to hear that you are acknowledging those things and recognize that we have to work to close those gaps. I know that another concern with carbon markets is that they may not incentivize large corporations to cut their carbon emissions, possibly leading to more pollution in underserved areas. Ms. Edelberg, how do you think the USDA and Congress can ensure that carbon markets do not lead to more pollution in environmental justice communities?
Well, I think the key point is the distinction between voluntary markets that we're talking about here and compliance markets. You know, EDF, and I think many of the panelists, if not all of the panelists here, would not be advocating for producers to be able to completely offset their emissions with credits from the agricultural sector, because frankly, it can be a little bit risky. We might get there at some point, we probably will, but right now we're just looking at voluntary markets, voluntary credits, and not allowing for those offsets to occur.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Edelberg, and to all the witnesses who are here today. Thank you for your time and your thoughtful answers to these questions to help inform our decision making. That's all I have, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes. The gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thought Mr. Milligan asked some very good questions in his testimony, and then combined with Ms. Merrill's her reminder to me of the 2010 crash of the prices for carbon credits. It got me thinking. I mean, I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I'm reasonably well versed in how farmers can get paid, all the flexibilities in how they get paid when they take grain to the grain elevator. Sometimes the price is set then, sometimes it's set later, sometimes they get paid then, sometimes they get paid later, sometimes the ownership transfers then, sometimes it transfers later. I don't really have any sense of how that works in the carbon credit market. And so is there, and I don't know whoever can answer this, but is there a standard approach, number one, currently in place in these voluntary markets about how and when producers get paid? Is there a lot of flexibility in that arena? And then is there a futures market that is likely to develop given this potential flexibility? And I'd love to have a couple people answer, so if nobody wants to take more than a minute or a minute and a half, that'd be great.
I can start. There is a futures market already exists. The CME Group actually launched a carbon futures market, and they're the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I think you can check that out. That's a recent development, and I think probably a good one. In terms of the flexibility for payments, I do think there is flexibility, and there are different approaches as to how that is achieved. Generally, however, farmers and ranchers are paid only once the credit is actually certified and verified. So it's kind of after they have done the work at the end of the season, if you will. That is why it's important to have some of those upfront USDA conservation payments. We actually use bill.com to pay our farmers and ranchers. They create an account and we just electronically deposit the payments that way to make it easy on them.
And again, I want somebody else to answer too, but maybe a quick follow-up, ma'am. So what if they changed these practices and wanted to, in essence, hold on to the commodity themselves for a while, the credit? I mean, is there an ability for them to sell that 6 months later?
Well, so I started at the initially talking about we're not operating in traditional offset markets. We're operating in supply chain emission reduction markets. And those credits need to be utilized annually. So there is a certain period of time that the company actually needs to claim them. In traditional carbon offset markets, and David could probably speak to this, they can in fact hold on to them. In our market, we actually don't sell a credit regardless until the farmer or rancher actually agrees for it to be sold. And I think that's a very important point, that this is farmer data. We're utilizing their farmer credits, and they should have a say and control over that.
Thank you, ma'am. Sure, go ahead.
Yes, sir. I think that's exactly right. And I think it's really down to every contract that there's variability on that. But if a farmer wanted to keep the underlying commodity and sell it later at a future time, that would be entirely possible. That's down to the negotiation that happens in between the farmer and whoever's going to buy the credit from them.
So what's most typical? I mean, because you just think about a farmer who probably doesn't want to maintain a lot of price risk, given all of the other exposure they have. Are most contracts for a set price into the out years, year 2, 3, 4? Oh, Mike.
Thank you. I can't speak to that. We don't see the contracts ourselves. We just certify the credits, so we don't see all the financial transactions behind them.
Could any of the panelists tell me what they think is most typical?
I can tell you that we currently are engaging farmers in annual contracts while we really test the system and see what works best. But we're really looking at 5-year contracts so that there's certainty on both sides of the ledger, both for the farmer and rancher, who are the sellers, and then the buyers, so that we know whatever you are looking at, for instance, when you join, that is your baseline, and you then have the opportunity to sell credits on an annual basis for the length of that 5-year contract.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised there aren't more multi-year contracts, just because the changes in practices these producers put into place often are a little more intensive on the front end, and I'd think they'd want a multi-year ability to recoup that investment. So perhaps that is a good development. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back. Oh, I do have some additional questions I'll submit for the record, sir.
Very fine. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, Mr. Lawson.
Chairman, I want to thank you all for calling this meeting today, you and the ranking member, Mr. Thompson. This is a very important meeting. To make sure I can get an answer from everyone in the small amount of time that we have, my question is what type, several of you mentioned that many aspects of the voluntary carbon market generates a lot of confusion because of how complex and diverse the different programs are. My question then was sent around to all of the witness. This would be to all of the witness. In your opinion, what would be ideal carbon market looks like? What ideal farm market would look like for farmers? If you all could comment on that, that would be greatly appreciated.
David Milligan, thanks for the question. I think the ideal carbon market, the carbon sequestration takes place at the farm. And I think these programs have to be designed that the majority of that money comes back to the farmer. It's not like wheat or something else where it's transferred and it's processed and it's shipped and there's freight and value, processed and changes value. It all happens right at the farm. The revenue stream needs to come back to where the carbon sequestration happened.
I'll jump in and say, I think very clear contracts for farmers and ranchers without a lot of tiny print, right? So that they're very understandable, are really necessary. I would also say harmonized, standardized approaches for how, in fact, they operate and how we buy and sell credits in these markets are, in fact, would benefit everyone.
If I might, Congressman Lawson, I would say the following, right? So we talked about common standards, transparency, clearly understandable rules for farmers. And I would say that in the end, it boils down to trust, right? So a market actually to thrive, we need to have trust from buyers who are willing to place their investments in the market and trust that actually whatever they're buying is necessary, something that's real and they can actually count on. So I think an ideal market is a market that actually has trust from farmers all the way to the buyers.
Thank you.
Can I add one element to that, which would be, thank you for the question, Congressman, is that I think one key aspect of an ideal market would be for the farmers to have confidence that the contracts that they're going to sign into have been vetted and that they have confidence that it's a real program that they're going to be using and that they're going to have value from the credits in the end of the day. There's a number of different options currently on the market, and it can be very confusing for farmers. So having some clarity around that could be very, very useful.
Thank you.
Congressman, I'm happy to jump in and provide, I think, 4 suggestions for a framework and a carbon market that EDF would like to see. First, it's important that it be very transparent. Second, we want to make sure that we're having verified quality emissions coming from that marketplace and from those operations. Third, we want it to be profitable. We want farmers to continue to make money, diversify their income, and see this as a profitable way to continue. So they'll continue the practices on their farm. And then fourth, we want it to be equitable and accessible by all farmers, regardless of size, commodity, geography. That's hard to do, as we've heard before, but I think we can eventually get there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And I would just weigh in, Congressman, to say that we would agree with many of those principles, but find that the carbon markets just haven't been able to deliver on those many fronts. And so we would much rather see the Farm Bill conservation programs scaled up and made accessible and focused on climate change so that we do have that diversity of farmers who can remain profitable, but can also have benefit from the technical assistance financial incentives so that they can not only reduce carbon emissions, but also become more resilient to greater weather extremes.
Okay, thank you.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to just start off by saying thanks to Ms. Spanberger, her and I have worked together on the Growing Climate Solutions Act, and I've worked also with Senator Braun. We're trying to find some innovative ways to help our farmers and ranchers. And I think there's a lot of confusion on this particular topic, and myself included have some learning to do. So I'd like to start off with a couple questions for Mr. Bastos and Ms. Heidelberg. I think other industries out there have access to carbon credits. Our ag community has not. Do I have that? Am I accurate with that statement?
Well, I think there's access right now, but it is in its infancy. It can be confusing and it can be complicated. And if we want more farmers to have access and we want the environmental benefits that are going to come, then we need to take some more proactive steps in this space.
Mr. Bastos, anything to add?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think, I would concur with Ms. Heidelberg here on this. I think it's, very clear.
A follow-up to this, what's the downside for a corn farmer or a wheat farmer in Nebraska for this bill that we're working on?
What is the downside?
Yes, I mean, there seems to be a lot of suspicion, but I don't see where the downside's at, but I thought maybe I'd ask you.
If I might, working with farmers every day as a company, I would say that I see very little downside. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned before is the need for technical assistance and how farmers actually can navigate the intersection of adopting practices, making sure that actually work on their farm. Every farm is actually unique by nature. So having technical assistance so they can actually make them work with the crops they produce so they can keep yielding more and at the same time doing sustainably and capture carbon, I think that's a need, and I think this bill can actually help on that.
It seems to me this is removing ambiguity as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the downside in this space is that we don't act, that we're not providing the standards, and we're not providing the measurement, and we're not providing the technical assistance to farmers, because that ship has sailed, the markets are happening, producers are getting involved, and we don't want poor quality credits to be emerging on the market. We don't want fraud to occur, and we don't want farmers to get shorted.
Mr. Antinoli, it looks like you got a follow-up here. You want to answer something?
I was going to pretty much echo what you said, but just add that there are currently a variety of different options that farmers have to generate carbon credits. And I think it's really important that they understand that the credits, that the programs that they use are going to generate high-value, real carbon credits that are going to help them in the long run, because those credits will have value in the market, but also help solve the climate crisis.
Does this not provide farmers an opportunity to improve their top line?
Excuse me?
Does this not provide the farmers an opportunity to improve their top line? I mean, this is going to improve their margins.
I think so.
Here's another question. There seems to be confusion. What's the cost to the federal government? Is there a cost to the federal government doing this, working this bill, ma'am?
The Senate version was scored by CEO, and there was no cost. There was a cost for manpower at USDA. That $4 million is in the bill to, I think it's, $4 million paid for out of rescissions that USDA is not spending. So the bill is neutral by CBO scoring.
Ms. Heidelberg, some today we're saying this is a government-run carbon market. It's not really. It's certifying other folks that will be monitoring this. Do I have that right?
So the bill would put USDA in the position to make sure that it's certifying and identifying the trusted advisors that farmers can go to, that they can go to a neutral third party and get the technical assistance and maybe the plan of action for how they could potentially engage in this market, and they know that they're getting that fair advice.
And I just want to stress it's totally voluntary.
Completely voluntary.
And I know that's some concerns for some people. So my final question with my last 39 seconds is to Mr. Milligan with the wheat growers. I know the Farm Bureau has endorsed Ms. Bamberger's and my bill. Where do the wheat growers stand on this?
Well, we have a committee that's set up to study climate sustainability, and we will put your before that committee, and maybe they'll make a recommendation to our board.
Okay, thank you. With my 16 seconds left, I yield back.
I recognize the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Spanberger, who is also the chair of our subcommittee on conservation, forestry, and is recognized for 5 minutes, and also is one of our outstanding leaders on the issue of climate change.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much. And to our witnesses, I have actually never been more excited in a committee hearing in my short time in Congress. I have been delighted and excited by this conversation, and I'm so grateful to go directly after my friend and colleague, Congressman Bacon, who asked extraordinary questions. I am just so excited because what we've heard today from our witnesses is that climate-smart agricultural and forestry practices can really help reduce the risks posed by climate change while creating valuable revenue streams. That means money. For the farmers and producers who choose to participate in voluntary carbon markets. And these markets are driven by an ever-increasing demand among corporations. And thank you to the representative from Bayer here to bring his voice to the conversation, from corporations looking to invest in ways to lower their footprints as we transition to a zero-carbon economy, maybe someday negative carbon economy. Unfortunately, these existing private markets are often challenging to navigate for companies and for small farmers alike. This has been made clear by the conversations I've had with the smaller scale producers and foresters in my district throughout Central Virginia, and I thought that Mr. Milligan, in his written testimony, provided really important questions about carbon markets. And so, as we've heard today, there are crucial questions that continue to loom about the best types of protocols for carbon sequestration practices, and how farmers or forest owners who want to perhaps implement these practices and want to perhaps create new revenue streams for themselves can join these markets. And that is why I am so excited to work with my colleague, Congressman Don Bacon, to reintroduce the Growing Climate Solutions Act this Congress. The exciting thing is the fact that we've had endorsements across the board. We've got lists, and Mr. Chairman, I submit for the record the list of entities that have endorsed this bill, from the American Farm Bureau to the American Soybean Association to the National Potato Council to the National Milk Producers Federation, to industry such as McDonald's, Bayer, Microsoft, Chobani, to environmental groups like Environmental Defense Fund, the National Wildlife Federation, the National Audubon Society. And I will say, not frequently do so many members of Congress agree on something, but certainly not frequently do so many organizations across sectors agree on something as straightforward as this bill. This bill would protect farmers and companies who want to participate in existing voluntary carbon markets by involving the USDA for certification. It would empower American farmers and forest owners to make informed choices about how to participate in voluntary carbon markets by really creating a one-stop shop for information about these markets. It would bring experts and trusted partners to the table alongside producers through the creation of a robust, producer-focused, and science-forward advisory council to make sure USDA is keeping up with the rapid innovations that occur in this space. And finally, this bill would not alter existing conservation programs or place undue burdens on growers or forest owners. In fact, I was impressed that Ms. Eidelberg, in her testimony, spoke about some of the co-benefits that actually present to farmers and producers. And notably, this bill also does not touch the funding of the Commodity Credit Corporation. So I am so excited this bill passed the Senate with a vote of 92-8. It had tremendous support, and I thank the sponsors in the Senate, Senator Braun and Senator Stabenow, for their work on this bill. And I have been so enthusiastic so far that I've left little time for questions, but I would like to begin. Ms. Eidelberg, I know there are discussions about, if we're even talking about carbon markets, we're accepting that carbon exists. Can you discuss how legislation like the Growing Climate Solutions Act would help provide growers and producers the resources they need to make informed decisions about practices on their land that we know are credible and actually help mitigate the impact of climate change?
Sure. So producers, I think, are very interested in engaging in a type of voluntary market because, as you mentioned, it's a way to diversify income, increase their bottom line. The challenge is that the markets are new, contracts are complicated. Finding ways to engage is probably going to require, in most cases, the help of a trusted advisor. Farmers use trusted advisors for everything from inputs, seed, tractors. I mean, they need help. So creating this verified advisor program through USDA, which frankly is very similar to how we do other programs at USDA, just provides that technical assistance that farmers need.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our witnesses for such an exciting hearing, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady from Florida, Mrs. Carmack, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Thompson, and to all of our witnesses here before us today. I'm very proud to represent part of the wood basket in North Central Florida, and just recently had a roundtable with my forest owners about this very issue. One of those owners I spoke with in my district recently described voluntary carbon markets as the, quote, Wild West. I have to say that I agree with his characterization. They've told me about the lack of consistent standards and the differences in returns depending on the carbon exchange. What I think shocked me the most, however, in these conversations was learning from one of my constituents when approached by a consultant working with a carbon exchange that they were going to have to pay $300,000 up front. They were told that they would have the opportunity to recoup this cost over time, but that there were no guarantees. So given this account, Ms. Merrill, have you heard, if anything, from farmers regarding upfront costs to participate in carbon markets? How do these costs compare to those associated with participating in California's Climate Smart Ag programs or USDA's conservation programs?
Thank you, Congresswoman, so much for the question. Yes, we have heard about high transaction costs, not only for the California compliance market, but also for the voluntary market. And that has meant largely that some mid-scale farmers simply can't get into the market. They can't afford it. The project development and verification costs are simply too high. So many simply can't afford to participate. What's different, of course, with the Climate Smart Agriculture programs, it's a grants-based program. You've got to develop a project, fill out an application, and implement that project. But we have technical assistance here in the state to support farmers of all scales and all types of operations to participate in the Climate Smart Ag programs. It's a grants-based program. It's modeled after the USDA Farm Bill conservation programs, which take an approach that we think will better meet the needs of farmers as well as better meet the needs of the climate crisis. The complexities of the carbon market are simply too great.
Well, and I would like to ask our panelists here today in person, generally, how are producers who may not be well capitalized, how are they able to enter these markets? And I'll start with you, Ms. Eckenberg.
I appreciate your comments because I have often described these markets as the Wild West as well. That being said, it's a perfect opportunity for Congress to step in and provide some clarity, to put that referee on the field, create some standardization, and make sure that farmers know exactly what they're getting into. We don't want anybody to be stuck with a $300,000 bill at the end of the day that they can't pay. That's not okay. So would welcome Congress's involvement to try to figure these issues out. There's a lot of different approaches, but if we fail to act in this space, whether that be giving USDA authority to take some action, Congress writing legislation in this space, or looking to some qualified third-party neutral actors, I think this problem is just going to get worse because that ship has sailed. This is happening. So what can we do to make sure that farmers are not coming up short?
Mr. Range, I caught you off guard. Sorry about that.
Well, I was just going to say that I would echo that tremendously. The payments for real legitimate carbon credits only come after you've done the practices. So that, of course, does imply that you have to invest in the technology or the whatever you need to implement those practices. But the idea that, the example you mentioned, I think is exactly the kind of challenge that you start to see more and more of if there isn't some consistency and some vetting of the folks who are providing these services, or offering these things to farmers.
I appreciate that, and I'm running short on time, so I'm sorry. I'm going to have to jump real quickly. Now, Mr. Milligan, could you estimate how many of your members participate in carbon markets, and are there any lessons those members have learned?
I can only take a guess, but I know on the committee there's some people that have had some experience as to whether they had it personally or not. So I'd say the number is very low. I think to your question, it's been pretty well raised here. It's kind of the Wild West. We need to have more criteria before we really know whether we're going to jump in.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Costa, who is also the chairman of our subcommittee on livestock and foreign agriculture, is recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing on voluntary, I underline the word voluntary, carbon markets in agriculture, which I think is part of America's agriculture's future. And I also want to thank our colleagues, Congresswoman Spanberger and Congressmember Bacon, for introducing, I think it was very important, companion legislation to Senator Stabenow. And it's really the opportunity, I think, that we need to seize. I think it is the Wild West. And guess what? The Wild West was an opportunity for new development and new opportunities in America. And I think what is lacking is the framework that this legislation provides. So, Mr. Anatoli, first to begin, you talked about in your opening comments about goals and milestones, and I don't know when you could have a fully matured carbon market, if you've determined or estimated what the potential is for American agriculture.
I don't have the numbers of what would mean in terms of, are you asking in terms of?
In terms of the reduction of carbon footprints, in terms of the benefits that would accrue to agriculture that would benefit as a result of that. I mean, there's got to be some research that's been done as what a fully matured carbon market might present to American agriculture and to improving the quality of our environment, I would think.
Yes, I don't have those numbers to hand.
Okay, well, get them to us. They're important. Jeannie Merrill, you've got your California experience, and I'm a Californian. What do you think the lessons to be learned based on the comments you've made here today?
Thank you, Congressman Costa. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I think we've got a lot of really important lessons in California, which is we have more farmers applying to our climate smart agriculture programs than we have funding for. The demand is high. Yes, we are seeing high demand for the voluntary markets, but as our former governor, Jerry Brown, liked to remind us, there are up times and there are down times. And we saw some pretty significant down times with the Chicago Climate Exchange when the bottom fell out.
No, I know.
And we would expect to see some down times again on the voluntary market, yet.
But that's the nature of markets, is it not?
Sorry?
That's the nature of markets, is it not?
It is absolutely the nature of markets. Yeah.
Let me quickly, because I don't have a lot of time. I had a curious question here, and the chair and members of this committee know clearly the challenges we've had in the West and the impacts of climate change with extreme droughts. We've got to fallow, again, a lot of land in California. Does fallowing the land in and by itself allow to participate in a voluntary carbon market that would bring some level of income in when farmers are not able to plant? Do you know?
I'm sorry, is that for me?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm not the right person to answer that question.
All right, we'll move on. Kelly Eidelberg, good to see you. Kelly, you talked about in your testimony that they need to be shovel-ready in voluntary markets. We all agree on that, and setting standards. On the issue of shovel-ready, specifically, what do you mean? And in terms of the standards, do you think the legislation that's been introduced by my colleague here that I am supporting creates the framework for those standards?
So, shovel-ready practices, I mean, I would pull examples like methane digesters. Those are being deployed on farms. Good soil health practices like cover crops, no-till. Those are fantastic opportunities for farmers. You know, we've seen a huge increase in cover crop adoption, but we're still nationally in single digits of the amount of farmers who've adopted cover
But as you know from your previous life and experience, Callie, cover crops are good if you got water to plant the cover crop. But since we're in extreme drought conditions, that's not the case. Let me ask you the same question I asked Jeannie Merrill. If you have to fallow land, could you potentially qualify to participate in such a market?
So I think you'd have to be able to go and actually measure the carbon sequestration in a particular field, and that's going to take some time. So I think there's a possibility that could occur, but it depends on the individual
Okay,
market.
my time's about expired, but I'll have some subsequent questions, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you for this important hearing, and thank my colleague, Congresswoman Spanberger, for your important legislation. Callie, it's good to see you.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Antonioli, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correct. How much have you been able to distribute to farmers to date?
So I'm sorry, I do not have, thank you for the question. I'm sorry, I do not have the answer to that question. We only certify the credits. The transactions and the working with the farmers is down to companies or technical providers, and they're the ones who end up working with the farmers and working with them to get the project certified, which then use our services. But we don't have any view into what actually is, what those transactions are. Our job is to ensure the quality of the credits themselves.
Gotcha. Mr. Bessis, your program as well, are you able to pay farmers? Can you speak to that? How much you've been able to distribute to farmers?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We have distributed to the farmers, actually paid over on the farmers starting July this year, and ended up paying all of them by the end of September.
I'm sorry, how much was that?
We actually, I mean, the total amount, I don't have here on top of my head, but I can tell the following. We paid as high as $170,000 to an individual farmer.
Okay, and where are these funds coming from?
From Bayer.
I'm sorry?
From Bayer's balance sheet.
From Bayer's, well, those funds from your balance sheet are coming from somewhere, though. Where's that coming from? Well, where's the income into your balance sheet? Basically, money comes into your company, eventually leaves your company. What are the inputs?
So we are a company that actually have activities in seeds, in crop inputs, basically. Right. We make those crop inputs that are sold to farmers, and based on those, the income that comes from those products, we actually use the.
But in relation to carbon markets, are you saying that's a loss leader for your company?
No, we actually engage with companies to represent agriculture in their offset agreements to have farmers actually as a source of offsets for these companies.
Okay, Ms. Merrill, could you speak to transaction costs?
Yes. Congressman, is your question what are transaction costs?
Well, a recent USDA report reported about 10% of carbon markets go to the farmer, actually. And so we end up taking relatively $10 out of an industry, and about $1 of it ends up in the farmer. And so somewhere there's some loss somewhere. And my concern is, if we're looking at an environment, that we need to look at the whole environment, the whole world industry approach to environment, because it's a global environment. And so taking $10 out of an industry that probably needs to be doing more investments in sustainable activities than the ag industry, which is probably where we get the green of the Green New Deal from, and $9, so we take $10 out of an industry that could be putting research into this, $9 ends up into a regulatory framework of somehow, and then $1 of it actually gets to the farmer. And so these are being marketed, in a sense, as this great help to farmers in the basis of an environment, but it seems like it's an overall taking from the effort. Mr. Anatoli, do you know what's been the greatest driver of reduction of greenhouse gases?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think it's important to recognize that carbon markets really ought to complement internal reduction.
That's not the question I asked. The question I asked is, what's been the greatest driver of the reduction in greenhouse gases?
I think the greatest driver has been the recognition that we need to do something about climate change.
It's been advancements in the natural gas industry. That's been the biggest driver and so we're taking $10 out of the oil and gas industry, for example, giving $9 into a regulatory framework and giving $1 to a farmer. And it just seems to me like this is more about creating a regulatory critical class, taking from producers, whether that be in the ag industry or whether that be in the oil and gas industry. And, you know, we already have, there's an important, we have programs already that help, you know, those adopting these practices early adopters, to help get them off the ground. And I would just question the voluntary carbon markets. It starts off voluntary, and then we ask the government to get involved, and then it becomes mandatory. This is just how government programs work. And it seems to me like the better approach would be to continue to practice some of the sustainable practices and programs that we can already have. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. And now we reach the close of our hearing, and what a hearing we have had. Many of you who are on our committee with your exchanges, our members, as our witnesses can see, we are very much interested in this issue, and we appreciate each and every one of you. And I want to thank each of you. First of all, I want to thank Ms. Debbie Reed, Executive Director of the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium. Thank you. I want to thank Mr. Leo Bastos, Senior Vice President, Head of Global Commercial Ecosystems at Bayer. I want to thank Mr. Brian Lacuma, President and Chief Executive Officer at the Westervelt Company, on behalf of National Alliance of Forest Owners, and Mr. David Antonioli, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Aral, and Ms. Callie Edelberg, Director of Government Relations at the Environmental Defense Fund, and Mr. David Milligan, President of the National Association of Wheat Growers, and Ms. Jeannie Merrill, Policy Director at the California's Climate and Agriculture Nature, on behalf of National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. What a wonderful help you've been to this committee and the nation, much of which many have been tuning into this. This is one of our most exciting hearings. All of our hearings are exciting and beneficial, but this one really has gotten the interest of many across the nation. And I just want to say, from my own conclusions as chairman, you all have answered some of my concerns. As you know, I do believe going forward, we're going to have to make sure that verification, measurement, how we do this with our farmers is really key as we determine how we engage them in the process of what they're doing in terms of carbon sequestration. And we got to be very careful on those 2 points, measurement and, of course, the verification. And again, I thank you all for answering my major concerns about our food security. We cannot allow that to even take second place to this, because that's what we rely on. And as many of you know, our economy in 44 of our states, agriculture is our most significant part of the economy of 50 states. So we have a lot in our hands. And as we fight these raging fires, we've got to find a way, because if we don't find a way, at the rate that these fires are burning up our western forests, the floods, what happened in New York with the deaths of the floods from the hurricanes. So we have so much at stake here. We really appreciate you and understand that the future of our agriculture is in our hands. And you have made a tremendous contribution this morning to the future of our nation. And we thank you for that. And so now, under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing, what an important hearing, will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witnesses to any question posed by a member. Please feel free, witnesses, if there's additional information that would be helpful to us in this committee to formulate the right kinds of policy going forward, please write us at this committee. And we thank you once again. God bless each and every one of you. Thank you for an excellent hearing. And this hearing on the Agriculture Committee is now adjourned. Thank you.